Hello, and thank you for choosing this full-length, clean, historical Western romance by Kat Lynn. We are so happy to have you with us today. Before we begin, don't forget to tap the subscribe button and like and share with your friends. Your support allows us to continue sharing these sweet, heartwarming stories for free. Now, relax and get ready to travel back in time to the American frontier, where we join an adventure to find love and happily ever after. Enjoy. Copyright of Kat Lynn. Colorado Christmas by Kat Lynn. Chapter 1. Denver, Colorado, 1870. Storm watched in awe as his wife paced up and down their living room, seemingly in a daze. The letter she'd received earlier that afternoon from New Orleans was clutched tightly in her hand, as if she was afraid that she might lose it if she put it down. But then again, who wouldn't be awestruck after receiving such wonderful news? Their life, though quite comfortable, was going to change in a tremendous way. "Violet, you're going to wear yourself out if you keep up with that," Storm said with laughter in his voice. "My love, do you know what this means for us?" Violet asked as she stopped pacing and went to sit on the couch next to her husband. "Yes, my love, I do. That's why I think you need to give it a few days before you can decide on what to do with your newfound fortune," he answered. "Our newfound fortune, and it's quite a sum, isn't it?" she asked, still not quite believing it herself. "Yes, it is," Storm answered and took his wife's hand into his and squeezed it lightly to reassure her that he indeed understood both her excitement and confusion. 6 months earlier, Violet had written to her trusted family lawyer and friend Charles, asking him whether he could sell off all of her father's assets back in New Orleans, as she couldn't look after the business effectively while she lived in Colorado. Her uncle Robert, who would have been the one in charge, had been jailed in Denver for life. Even now, years later, the thought of her uncle's misdeeds brought a bitter taste to her mouth. Out of greed, he'd killed his own brother and then attempted to kidnap her when she relocated to Colorado. Though he'd apologized and also turned over all of his assets to her, Violet still carried the weight of his betrayal on her shoulders every day. She could never forget how he'd come up with the absurd idea of marrying her so that he could take all of her inheritance from her. The thought of what her uncle was asking of her was too much for her to bear, and she'd decided to become a mail-order bride to escape from him. She'd then left everything behind and moved to Colorado to meet her groom. Violet had arrived in Colorado with a lot of hope, only for it to be dashed by Storm's younger brother Luke. Luckily for her, Storm had come to her rescue, and now, 7 years later, they were happily married and with a family of their own. Now that you've finally received confirmation that the proceedings have been deposited into your bank account, you should think very carefully about how you wish to spend them, is all I'm saying, Storm stressed further. "I understand you, and I've got the perfect idea to start with," Violet answered, her eyes suddenly lighting up. "I'd like to hear all about it," he answered, eager to know. "We should invite everyone this Christmas season to celebrate our good fortunes with us," she gushed. "That's a great idea, but is it really necessary to tell them everything?" Storm asked. "Well, I don't see what the problem is with them knowing, but since you insist," her voice trailed off. What was he being so conscious about? Weren't they all one big happy family? "Violet, news like this shouldn't be told to every Tom, Dick, and Harry, regardless of who they are," he said in a serious tone, and his wife nodded her head nonchalantly. She still didn't see what the problem was. Their conversation was interrupted by the sounds of their children running down the stairs, each trying to outdo the other. The two older ones, Ben and Sarah, were the first ones to get into the living room, and the twins, Jeremy and Charles, came in last. "Ben, I have told you many times that I don't like you running down the stairs like that." Their mother castigated her firstborn son. "Your brothers could fall and get seriously hurt." "But Mama, no one fell," Ben answered. Sarah stood next to him, saying nothing. She was 1 year younger and she adored her older brother. She would do everything that he did, even climb trees like him, something that irked Violet to the core. "Don't be too hard on the boy, my love. He's right. Nobody got hurt," Storm answered as the twins went to perch on each of his knees. They were only 4 years old and would do whatever their older siblings did. "Well, that doesn't make it any better," Violet said, upset that Storm always took the kid's side even though she knew he meant well. "They won't do it again. Or will you?" he asked, turning to the kids, and all four of them shook their heads vigorously no, including the twins. Violet couldn't help but smile at the adorable sight, her earlier anger now forgotten. Later that night, as Storm lay next to his wife, he thought of everything that had transpired that day. While the news was welcome, he couldn't help but feel inadequate. When they got married years earlier, their union had been marred by controversy, and they had to move from the ranch house to a house of their own. Violet had financed most of the construction from her inheritance, and Storm always felt as if he still owed her. Now, she'd receive another big chunk of money, and without a doubt she would insist on helping around the house. Storm knew that he couldn't refuse her offer without her getting offended, but he wished it had been the other way around. But this was all in his head, as Violet had never made him feel any less of a man of the house. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his issues stemmed from what his first wife, Dorothy, had done to him. Dorothy couldn't hold a candle to Violet, and it was about time he pushed any thoughts of her to the back of his mind. He turned to his wife, who was snoring softly next to him, and snuggled close to her, feeling her warmth. It still amazed him that she was his, and with a smile, he drifted off to sleep. Chapter 2. Los Angeles, California, 1870. Robert Morgan glanced at the creased piece of newspaper in his hand a second time and then threw it away in disgust. Even in death, he still despised his parents for having named his sister Lindsay as their heiress. It had served her right not to have inherited a single cent after the bank repossessed the house as well as the grocery store. A sharp pain cut across the side of his head, and he realized he must have drunk more whiskey than he'd have anticipated. He felt into his shirt pocket and realized that he'd spent almost all of the money he'd won gambling the previous night. "Mr. Morgan, your rent is overdue." Paul, a short, stern-looking man, barked at Robert as he went up the stairs to his second-floor room at the boarding house. "Mr. Jones, I'm sorry for the delay. I still haven't received the money I told you about. Give me until this coming Friday, and I will have your money," Robert said, feigning a smile while on the inside he was seething with anger. The said boarding house was a rundown structure, and it wasn't even worth the money he paid for it, he fumed. "I heard the same story last week. Consider this your last notice. If you're unable to pay your dues, kindly vacate from my premises. I'm trying to run a business here," Paul said, his tone indicating that he'd had enough of Robert's lies. "Okay, Mr. Jones," Robert said, his head throbbing so badly that all he wanted to do was to lie down before he gathered his thoughts on what to do next. Paul made a disapproving sound with his mouth as he walked past Robert and disappeared down the stairs. Robert looked at the landlord's retreating back for a while before he turned and entered his room and closed the door behind him. It reeked of stale alcohol, and a horrid moldy smell hung in the air, making his headache worse. When did he fall this low? Robert and his sister Lindsay had lived a comfortable life growing up, and they lacked for nothing. Their parents doted on them, but Robert always felt as if they favored Lindsay. And as they grew older, he began to become spiteful. When he was 16, he began associating with the town's riffraff, and before long he was drinking and gambling in local taverns. Soon, he began disappearing from home for long periods of time until his parents became fed up with him and let him be. It was during one of those escapades that his parents had died in an accident. He never shed a tear for them, and neither did he go home for their burial, even though he was in Los Angeles all that time. He watched as the bank took everything from his sister, and even when she moved away, he knew, though he had no idea where she'd gone to. One day, while walking around in town, he'd met with Emma, Lindsay's friend, and she'd told him that Lindsay had left a forwarding address with the sheriff. Robert had rushed over to the sheriff's office, and after a serious dressing down from the sheriff, he'd finally handed over the address to him. Now, as he lay on his rickety bed, he realized it was time he made use of it. Robert was overjoyed when Lindsay wrote him back. He could tell how genuinely happy she was to hear from him, but he didn't care. All he wanted from her was what he could milk from her. He'd gambled and won a couple of times, thus managing to keep Paul out of his hair for the time being as he waited for his big break. "Mr. Jones, I gave you my word, but you didn't believe me. Here, this is all that I owe you," he gloated as he handed Paul his money early one morning. "I must say I'm pleasantly surprised, Mr. Morgan," Paul replied, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Don't be. I'm a man of my word, and I always pay my dues, always," he replied. Prosody. One of these fine days, he was going to have so much money that he might even come back, buy Paul's dilapidated boarding house, and turn it into one of the beautiful hotels in California. Paul had a funny-looking expression on his face as he walked away from Robert. He couldn't quite place his finger on it, but he knew that Robert was up to no good. It was a matter of time before it all came crashing down, Paul mused. Robert could see that Paul wasn't buying his explanation, and he too knew that his luck would soon run out. He hoped to be far away from California when that happened. Lindsay would be his ticket out of there. In his next letter, he would ask her to invite him over to Denver. He could tell from her letters that she was happy and well settled. Perhaps she had gotten married to one of those wealthy gentlemen he always saw in California, telling anyone who cared to listen that they were there on business. Well, he couldn't wait to find out. "I'm leaving this God-forsaken place any time now," Robert bragged to his fellow gamblers one night at the gambling den. "Where would someone like you go? You're poorer than a church mouse," one of the men said, and the rest burst into loud laughter. "I'm going out west to visit my dear sister. I don't think I'll be coming back," he shot back. "Which sister? The one you haven't laid eyes on in years?" another one of the men quipped. "Well, she's still my sister now, isn't she?" Robert sneered. "I guess so," his friend agreed. That night he had a stroke of luck and won a huge amount of money. He bought all of his friends numerous shots of whiskey, but he made sure to keep his rent money in a separate pocket lest he used it as well. As they drank and made merry afterwards, he regaled them with tales of how wealthy his sister was, and it gave him great pleasure to see how jealous some of them became as they hung on to every word that came out of his mouth. Chapter 3. Denver, Colorado. Lindsay sat on her front porch, as she'd always done for years, staring into the horizon. A lot was happening in her life, and even though she'd kept it from her husband Eric, she felt it was now time that he found out what was going on. He was the easiest person to talk to, and she always felt better afterwards. If all else failed, Eric's older brother Storm, who lived on the other side of the ranch with his family, was another great listener. Many were the times she couldn't believe how lucky she'd been to have married into such a family. As she trained her eyes toward the direction she knew her husband was bound to appear from, she noticed a small cloud of dust and immediately knew it was him. He only rode that slowly when he had the children with him. Early that morning, their 6-year-old son Robert had insisted that he wanted to see the newly born calves that were only a few days old. His younger sister Becky had insisted that she too wanted to see them. Eric in particular, after having grown up with 5 brothers, doted on his young daughter, and Lindsay always worried that the child would grow up to be an entitled and spoiled individual. "Becky has the kindest of hearts, dear. She's going to be an amazing wife and mother one day," Eric would reassure her whenever she fretted. On her part, Lindsay tended to favor her son, whom she'd named after her dear brother. This didn't go unnoticed to Eric, but he knew how much her brother's disappearance had affected her over the years. After all, he was the only family she had left after their parents' death. "A penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Lucas," Eric said after he'd helped the kids to the ground and they'd instantly taken off chasing after some butterflies. "You have no idea how much I have on my mind," Lindsay said in a sad voice. Surprised, her husband walked up to her and took her hand. She had been okay that morning or so, he'd assumed. "Maybe we should talk about this later on," she answered, and her voice quivered. "No, my darling, we're going to talk about it right now. What has you like this?" he asked as he now pulled a chair and sat in front of her with their knees touching. He then gently lifted up her face to his with his forefinger. "Oh, darling, I don't know why I feel this way yet. I should be happy," she began. "I have been corresponding with Robert for a while now." "What? Why didn't you tell me that you were finally in touch with each other? How's he, and more importantly, where is he?" Eric asked, and Lindsay was taken aback. She had expected Eric to be upset that she had kept this secret from him. On the contrary, he seemed more concerned about her brother's well-being. "I don't know why I hadn't told you earlier. It could be because I was in shock myself when he reached out to me after so many years, even though I'd left a forwarding address for him. He says he's always been in Los Angeles. That's why I don't understand why it took him so long to get in touch," she replied. "You have to remember he's always been sick and was probably too ashamed to show himself after your parents' death," Eric answered. "We didn't see our brother Luke for a long time, and yet he was here in Denver. I realize that, but a year after I arrived here, I was told that he was doing much better and was trying hard to put his life back together." "So many things don't make sense, my love," she said. "Well, now that you're in touch, what next?" he asked. "He wants to come over this Christmas season," Lindsay answered. "Wonderful. Then go ahead and invite him over. I know you have so much to catch up on," her husband answered with a smile. "Really, you're okay with that?" she asked hesitantly. "Prosody. Of course, Robert is now my family as well, and I'd love to meet him," he said. "All right. I will write to him tonight," she answered, and hugged her husband, her heart now at peace. She couldn't imagine anywhere else she would rather be than right here with this loving man. Just then, Robert and Becky came back running, but they slowed down when they saw their parents embracing each other. Robert immediately covered his eyes, while 4-year-old Becky went to pull her father away from their mother by his leg. Lindsay and Eric pulled away from each other. "Robert, why are you covering your eyes?" Lindsay asked, laughing. "I don't want to see that, Mama," the young boy replied as he uncovered his eyes. "You'll hug your wife like this as well when you get married," Eric said, and Robert made a disgusted face. "I will not have a wife, Papa," he said, and their parents laughed harder this time. Eric picked up Becky, who was still holding on to his leg. "And you, my precious, will you have a husband?" he asked. "Yes," she exclaimed as she clapped her little hands together, too young to understand what her father was asking her. "Well, my darlings, let's go inside and find out what I've made you for dinner today," Lindsay said as she took her son's hand, and they all walked together into the house. Chapter 4. A few days after Violet and Storm had the conversation regarding inviting the whole of the Lucas clan for Christmas celebrations at their home, Violet felt that it was time she let each one of the other 5 families know in advance. She wouldn't tell them about the money, as she'd promised her husband. When she first arrived in Denver, she was supposed to get married to Storm's younger brother Luke, but he wasn't what he'd led her to believe before she left New Orleans. Back then, he was the family's black sheep, and he wouldn't listen to anybody, even the kind lady who'd acted as their mother and had chaperoned for all of them before they were married, Mrs. Anderson. That was back then, and now Luke was as much a family man as the rest of his brothers. Storm swooped in and saved her from Luke's ill treatment of her, and before the two knew it, they'd fallen in love, much to the chagrin of the younger brothers who felt that they shouldn't be together. Looking back now, it all seemed like a bad dream to Violet. The brothers had accepted them, and nobody would have thought the beginning had been that rocky. In all her sister-in-laws, Violet was closer to Eric's wife Lindsay, who'd been the second mail-order bride to arrive at the Lucas Ranch. They would comfort each other whenever they were overcome with sadness, mostly because they'd both lost their parents so tragically. "Who would like to go with me to Uncle Eric's house tomorrow?" Violet asked her kids one evening after dinner. They all raised their hands apart from Ben. "Why don't want to go with us, darling? Becky always spits and pinches me whenever I go to their house. I don't think she likes me at all," Ben said, and Violet stifled a laugh. "Come now, dear. Becky is a baby. She's younger than Jeremy and Charles. I'm sure she likes you, and that's her way of playing with you. Have you ever told Uncle Eric or even Aunt Lindsay that she does that to you? Violet asked, and Ben shook his head no. What about Robert? Do you feel that he dislikes you as well? No, but he likes playing with girls, Ben whined. You also play with Sarah, don't you? His mom pressed. Yes, Mama, but Sarah is my sister and she's nice to me, he answered, looking to the floor. Just then, Storm walked in and quickly noticed that there was something going on between mother and son. What's going on here? He lightly asked as he took his seat opposite his wife. Ben here doesn't want to go with us to his Uncle Eric's house tomorrow. He says Becky is mean to him and Robert likes playing with girls. Violet explained, trying very hard not to laugh. Storm noticed, and it was he who was now trying not to burst into laughter himself. Ben, is that true? Storm asked his son as his wife scooped some potatoes and beef stew from the pot and laid it before him. Thank you, my love. Yes, Papa, it's all true, Ben answered, his gaze still on the floor, and Storm could tell that Ben was bound to burst into tears if he was prodded further. Tell you what, son, your mama, Sarah, and the twins will go to Uncle Eric's. Meanwhile, you will accompany me as we go to brand the cattle with the ranch hands tomorrow, he said, and Ben's face lit up. Really, Papa? You'll take me along with you? He asked in disbelief. Earlier on, Storm wouldn't have agreed to take his son as he felt that the process would be too traumatic for the boy. He now felt it was time he started doing manly things with him. Yes, I will, Storm answered, and Ben flew from his seat and engulfed his father in a bear hug. Violet looked on in shock. She'd had no idea that her son detested going to his uncle's house because of that little terror named Becky that much. Long after the kids had gone to bed, Storm and Violet sat by the fireplace, each sipping coffee from a mug. This had been their routine even before the children were born, and Mrs. Anderson used to tease them a lot about it. I know how close you and Lindsay are. Remember what we talked about. Don't spill all your beans in one sitting, Storm said. Knowing how close those two were, he knew it would be next to impossible for Violet to keep the great news from her best friend. I know, my darling. We will only talk about what is important. Don't fret too much, Violet replied, slapping her husband playfully on the leg. Yes, I could be worrying about nothing, but it doesn't hurt to be cautious, he replied. I was thinking if you were to worry this much about someone finding out about our windfall, it would be Luke. Given his history, maybe such news could set him back, Violet said, and immediately regretted her words. She could tell that she had hit a raw nerve with her husband. I'm so sorry, my love. I didn't mean to be so insensitive. I just thought... I know what you thought, Violet, and you're wrong. Luke has come a long way, and I doubt he'd ever return to those vices, Storm interrupted his wife. How dare she say that? I realize that now, and I shouldn't have said that. Please forgive me, she begged. Storm rarely got upset, and for him to react like that, she must have really hurt his feelings. It's very unfair to pick on him like that because of his past, he said. Violet scooted over to him and placed her arms around him. Forgive me, my love, forgive me, she said, and she felt his body begin to relax. He placed his arms around her and hugged her back. He might have overreacted to her statement as well. He comforted himself. Chapter 5. The following morning, Storm and Ben left with the ranch hands for the cattle branding while Violet got Sarah and the twins ready for their short trip to Lindsay's house. Fall was upon them, and the weather was cooler, making it perfect for a ride on the cart. Violet would smile whenever she rode one, as she recalled how difficult it had seemed when she first arrived in Colorado. Now, she could ride whenever she wanted, as long as the weather conditions allowed, without needing her husband's help. As she had anticipated, the ride to Lindsay's house was cool and relaxing, and as she pulled into her friend's driveway, she hoped it would still be like that when it was time for them to go back home. Robert heard the cart wheels first, and he came to the front door and peeped outside before he dashed back into the house, most probably to alert his mother. Just like Violet, Lindsay had opted to look after the house herself without the help of a nanny or even a housekeeper. It gave them great pleasure to bring up their kids by themselves, and their husbands appreciated the same. Some of their sisters-in-law opted to have help around the house, but Lindsay and Violet would hear none of it. "Violet, it's so nice to see you. It's been a while, dear," Lindsay gushed as soon as Violet and the kids stepped on the ground. Jeremy rushed towards his aunt, who promptly picked him up, covered his chubby cheeks with kisses until the little boy couldn't take it any longer. He kicked to be placed down as pearls of laughter shook his tiny body. Next, it was Charles's turn, and Lindsay rained kisses on him until he couldn't take it any longer either, and he was set down. This was probably why Becky gave Ben a hard time. Maybe she could see how her mom was fond of her niece and nephews, Violet mused. "Well, what are we waiting for? Please come in," Lindsay said as she led them into the house. "You have repainted the house since I've been here, I see," Violet observed, and she made a mental note to give her house a facelift as well before the big Christmas celebration. "Yes, I did. The paint on the walls was beginning to peel off, and I couldn't have that," Lindsay replied, very happy that her efforts had been noticed. "It does look very beautiful and gives the house a homely feel, if I may say so myself," Violet observed. Since the first time they met, Violet could tell that Lindsay had grown up in a privileged environment up until disaster struck. Their stories were eerily similar. After another round of small talk, the children were conveniently sent away to give the adults privacy to talk. "Now, Lindsay, I came over to personally invite you to my house for Christmas. Actually, I will be inviting everyone that belongs to this family," Violet said, and she could see that her friend was somewhat taken aback. "Of course, Violet, my family and I will be there. But I don't understand why you're inviting everybody this early. Fall has just started," Lindsay observed. "I know, and there is a reason why I want everyone at my house. It's my way of giving back," Violet said, and suddenly Storm's words came to her mind. Would she really be able to keep her mouth shut? After all, this was her close friend. What harm would it do if she told her the truth? "Violet, is everything okay?" Lindsay asked, when it looked as if her friend was suddenly lost in her own thoughts. "Yes, it is. Listen, I need to tell you something, and you have to promise that you'll keep it to yourself," Violet said, and Lindsay shot her friend a confused glance. "I can't even say anything to my husband?" she asked. "Yes, especially your husband. Storm would find out that I went against his wishes," Violet stressed. "Okay, I promise," Lindsay said, wondering what the big secret was. Violet started talking, and the more she did, the wider Lindsay's eyes grew. "Atrocity. You see now why you shouldn't tell anyone?" she asked a visibly shocked Lindsay. Yes, and please don't worry about it," she answered, her mind still racing. She had no idea that Violet still stood to inherit so much money and several bars of gold to boot from her late father's company. For a split second, she felt jealous that the bank had taken everything that had belonged to her parents, and now neither she nor Robert had anything to show for it. "Now that we're on the same page, will you help with the cooking?" Violet asked. "Of course, dear. I'll help you with anything you may need. I'm sure Minnie wouldn't mind helping as well. She's an excellent cook. Can you imagine she used to cook and clean after 4 adult brothers, as well as her parents back in Chicago? Mail-order brides. We sure have faced our fair share of tribulations," Lindsay sighed. Minnie was the young lady who'd married Luke, and they were now very happy. "Yes, Minnie made a good man out of Luke. I'm very proud of them both," Violet said. Over the years, the girls would get together and talk about their past lives, and it was obvious that some had gone through tougher times than others. In the end, all that mattered was that they had gone on to create great families of their own, the pains of the past almost forgotten. That evening, while she was at home with her husband, Violet hoped she hadn't made the worst mistake of her life by entrusting her secret with Lindsay. Storm would never forgive her if something happened to jeopardize their otherwise bright future. Chapter 6. Violet spent a few more days inviting all of her sisters-in-law and their families to her home over Christmas, and even though most of them didn't quite understand why she'd decided to invite them that early, she would only tell them that she really needed everyone to meet at her house, and that it would make Storm happy as the eldest of the brothers. I wish my siblings from Ireland were able to come too. Eileen, the youngest of the brides who was married to the youngest of the Lucas brothers, Greg, said as tears glistened in her eyes. Hush now, Eileen. You know anything is possible during Christmas, Violet said, trying to cheer her up. Her story of how she came to America was particularly sad, and Violet often told her how brave she thought Eileen was. Violet, I have to be sincere with myself. Greg can't afford to bring them over, even if he wanted. He is doing a good job supporting them over there since our parents died, and I can't imagine burdening him with bringing them over, she said. I understand, but you promised to be happy on that day knowing that your siblings will be happy too back at home? You're lucky that Greg is helping them out. I'm sure he'll make their Christmas great as well, Violet said as she walked over to Eileen and gave her a hug. I promise, and should you need anything, let me know. Eileen answered as she hugged Violet back. She was lucky to have a great family here in America, as well as another one back in Ireland. By the end of that week, Violet had invited everyone, and all that remained now was to start planning for the big day. First, she would have to go to the bank to make sure her money was safe. Charles had also informed her that her father had left her 5 bars of gold, and she had to make sure even those were safely stored away. On the eve of her appointment with the bank, Violet asked Storm whether he could accompany her as she needed for him to know everything there was to know just in case. Nothing bad is going to happen to you. I don't like it when you speak like that, Storm said after she'd told him why she needed for him to know everything. I know what you mean, my love, but these things happen. Had my father known he was going to be murdered that day by his brother, he would have handed all of his money and assets to me before he left the house. Sadly, neither he nor I knew of the danger that awaited him at work, she answered, a huge lump growing in her throat. Okay, I understand, but can we not talk about this topic anymore? Storm said as he joined his wife in bed. He knew it would take him a while to fall asleep after that haunting discussion. 8 o'clock the following morning found them at the bank's doors, and when they were finally opened 30 minutes later, Storm and Violet were the first ones to be ushered into the manager's office. Mr. and Mrs. Lucas, it's such a pleasure to have you in my office this early in the morning, the manager, a short, pot-bellied man with a pockmarked face and with huge bifocals sitting on the bridge of his nose, said. Oh, how important people treat you when you have money, Violet mused. We're glad to hear that, sir, Storm said, but the manager held up his hand to say something. Oh, come now, Mr. Lucas. There's no need for that. Just call me Frederick, or Fred in short, he said, and Storm wanted to laugh in his face. Only a few years ago, he'd come here in need of an urgent loan to put up their present house, and the same man had rudely turned him away, alleging that the bank couldn't trust Storm with such a huge amount of money. Yes, Frederick, Mrs. That. Lucas here needs to know about the transaction her lawyer made for her from New Orleans, Storm said, turning to his wife, who sat ever so quietly by his side. Well, Mrs. Prosody, Lucas, your lawyer did make the said transaction, and the full amount was this, Frederick said as he scribbled something on a small piece of paper and then pushed it across to Violet. Of course, after that, he deducted his payment, and the remaining amount is this. Storm and his wife looked at the second paper, and the amount was staggering, even after Charles had taken his share. Your 5 bars of gold are in our safe deposit box as well, the manager said, his earlier smile still plastered on his face. He couldn't risk losing such worthy customers. He could kiss their feet as well if need be, he thought. Well, Frederick, we're happy to hear that everything is excellent, and we hope it will remain so, Storm said, and the man's eyes lit up. They would continue doing business with his bank even after the way he'd treated Storm poorly years earlier. Yes, he did remember. Of course, Mr. and Mrs. Lucas, kindly feel free to drop in any time you wish. I'm always at your service, Frederick said, as Storm and his wife rose from their seats, and so did he. That will be all for today, Frederick, Storm said, and the man shook his hand, and he and Violet walked out of the office. On their ride back home, each was engrossed in their own thoughts. They had known the money would be a lot, but the final figure was unbelievable. Violet could now understand why her uncle had so heartlessly murdered her father and why he was so hell-bent on marrying her so he could take everything. It still didn't make what he did right, and she was happy that he would spend the rest of his miserable life in jail. No amount of apologizing would ever make her forgive him, she vowed under her breath. Chapter 7. Robert couldn't believe what his sister was saying in her latest letter. So he had been right all along. She had married into a rich family, and even though the money she was talking about was neither hers nor her husband's, it helped that it was still in the family. What excited him the most were the bars of gold Lindsay had told him about. He knew that even with just one bar, his life would change in an instant. What about 5 of them? He tried to sleep, but the excitement was too much. After tossing and turning in bed for a while, he got up and walked over to the window, pulled the tattered curtain to the side, and looked outside. The streets below were empty, and even if he'd wanted to go out for a shot of whiskey, all the saloons around town were closed by that time of the night. As he stood there staring at nothing in particular, it dawned on him that now more than ever he had to go to Denver. His destiny was beckoning at him. He'd let himself go through the years with his heavy drinking and tobacco chewing, but now he needed a complete makeover. He would have to make himself appear presentable before the Lucas clan, as Lindsay fondly referred to them, so that when he finally did strike, nobody would suspect him. He tried to figure out what Violet looked like, but nothing came to mind. Her husband Lindsay had said was the eldest of the brothers, and his first wife had run away with a traveling merchant, leaving him desolate. Luckily, Violet had come into his life and changed all that. So without Violet, Storm would once again sink into depression. Robert smiled happily to himself, realizing that he'd just found a weakness that he could use to his advantage. This was becoming easier the more he thought about it, and he could almost smell the gold bars. Giddy with excitement, he walked back to bed, and this time sleep came quickly. He dreamed that he was rich, and the boarding house was a beautiful hotel hosting all the wealthy men coming to Los Angeles on business. Lindsay felt as if she'd told his brother more than she should have about Violet's fortune, considering that he was a recovering gambler, as soon as she mailed the last letter. This could make him think that there was a way to get to the money, even though she'd made it clear to him that the money wasn't hers. All she could hope for now was that her brother had changed as he'd claimed from the beginning. She was feeling unsettled, and she couldn't understand why. Lindsay was so engrossed in her thoughts that she failed to notice that her husband had walked into the living room until he touched her on the shoulder. She almost jumped out of her skin. "What is you like this, my love?" Eric asked, thinking that maybe something bad had happened to her brother. "Come and sit next to me, please," she said as she patted the empty space next to her on the couch. Eric slowly sat down, expecting to hear the worst. "I think I've made a terrible mistake." "What do you mean?" her husband asked, not quite understanding what she was talking about. "What have you done?" Lindsay then went on to tell him what Violet had confided in her, and he listened carefully without interrupting his wife. When she was finished, he turned to her and looking her straight in the eye, he said, "You shouldn't have done that. If Violet finds out, she will be very disappointed considering the strong friendship you two have shared for years." "I know, and believe me, I've beaten myself up for this the whole day. I wish I hadn't said anything to Robert," she sighed. Eric placed a comforting hand on her shoulder as he realized how much she was suffering. "What's done is done. That amount of money can't be stored in the house. I'm sure it's in a safe place, and neither Robert nor anybody else can easily get to it," he reassured her. "Prosody?" "Do you think I should still let Robert come to visit?" she asked. "Of course, I don't see why not. It would look strange if you suddenly canceled his invitation without an explanation. He might never forgive you for that." "Think about it carefully," Eric said, and his wife nodded her understanding. "Will you tell Storm?" she asked meekly. "No, he will tell me all about it when he's good and ready," he replied, and a big sigh of relief escaped from Lindsay. As the days passed, and Lindsay waited for her brother's letter to arrive, She could almost sense what he was going to say to her. She would go ahead and send him money for a train ticket and then hope for the best. She sent a letter to her friend Emma, asking whether Robert was still on the straight and narrow, but she still hadn't heard back from her, which was quite unusual. Maybe there was a delay along the way, and she decided to be patient. Every night before she fell asleep, she would imagine all sorts of bad things that could happen to Violet because of her big mouth, but she would push those thoughts to the back of her mind as she struggled for hours to fall asleep. Chapter 8. Robert smiled as he grasped Emma's letter in his hand. He'd known that Lindsay would write to her asking about him, and he couldn't have Emma spoiling his plans. She had found out by now that he hadn't changed, and he knew that she would report this to Lindsay the first chance she got. It would be worse if she knew that he would soon be going to Colorado. All he was waiting for now was for Lindsay to send money for his train ticket, as she had earlier promised, and hoped that she would do so before winter set in. It would be no fun traveling in all that snow. Robert, lately you've been in very high spirits. Care to share? One of his many gambling friends asked one evening. Lance, have you ever touched a bar of gold in your whole miserable existence? Robert asked the man as he quickly downed another shot of whiskey. He closed his eyes as he felt the hot liquid burn the back of his throat before it finally settled in his tummy. Well, have you? No, Robert, have you? Lance threw the question back at him, and everybody at the table laughed. No, I haven't either, Lance, but unlike most of you, I will very soon, he answered as he downed yet another shot, oblivious to the stares around him. Tell us more then, Lance pushed him. Almost everybody in Los Angeles knew that all of his late parents' properties had been repossessed by the bank, leaving them with nothing. His sister had shortly after left town and hadn't returned ever since. Where then would Robert find the gold he was so busy telling everyone about? You don't worry about the details. I'll be gone for Christmas, but when I come back, I will have all of you working for me at my new hotel, he bragged as he basked in the attention he was receiving. What hotel? Another of the friends asked. You will all see when I get back, he answered, and all at the table fell silent. He hadn't been this bold before, and a few of the men felt that there could be some truth to what he'd been saying. Do you think there is any truth to what he's been saying for a while now? Maybe his sister is the one that has the gold, one of the men said as soon as Robert walked to the washroom. I bet there could be some truth to it. If it's true his sister got married out west, she could have married one of those gold prospectors we hear about. She could be the one with the gold and wants to help him, another said. She would be a fool to help such an ungrateful person. He never bothered with her when their parents died. He couldn't even be bothered with the burial arrangements. The poor girl did everything by herself. When the bank took away everything they owned, she suffered the humiliation alone, the first man said, and they all nodded their agreement. It had taken months before folks stopped gossiping about the misfortunes that had befallen the poor girl. Well, well, people, where were we? Robert arrogantly asked as soon as he returned from the washrooms, to everyone's chagrin. One by one, the men moved away from the table, but Robert wasn't bothered. Soon, they would be kneeling in front of him, begging for his help. The money arrived for Robert a few weeks later, just as his sister had promised. He noticed that in the letter she had enclosed the money in, she hadn't said anything about her sister-in-law's inheritance. It didn't matter, though. She had already told him enough, and the rest remained to be seen when he arrived in Colorado. In 2 weeks' time, winter would be upon them, and he felt that it was imperative that he bought his ticket quickly and then leave in a week's time when his rent ran out. He couldn't wait to gloat at his landlord, Paul, that he was leaving and didn't plan on coming back to the boarding house. He bought his ticket the following morning, and as he went back home, Robert was overcome with excitement. In a few days, he would be on his way to Denver, and he could already picture his new life, rich and with everything he'd ever wished for. He paused just for a second to think about how Lindsay would handle the betrayal, but he quickly shrugged the moment of weakness away. When he arrived at the boarding house, he felt that there wasn't a better time to speak to Paul than then. He approached the man's office door and knocked gently. A voice from the inside answered for him to come in. "Robert, what brings you here?" Paul asked. It wasn't end of the month yet, and he couldn't figure out what this troublesome tenant wanted from him. "How do you do, Paul? I wondered if I could have a minute of your time," Robert answered, and the other man showed him to a seat. "Well, let's hear it," Paul said with an exasperated look on his face. "I will be moving out of my room at the end of the month." Robert began, and he could see the shocked expression on his landlord's face. "I'm traveling out west in a few days." "Oh, I see. I'm happy that you've let me know in advance," Paul answered. He had never thought he would ever see this day. "That's all I had to say. If you'll excuse me," Robert said, and rose. As he walked toward the door, he could feel Paul's eyes on his retreating back, and he smiled. Paul had probably assumed that he was there to give excuses about why he would be late paying his next rent. This was only the beginning. The next time Paul saw him, he would most likely not recognize him. Robert thought smugly. Chapter 9. Violet and Storm went about their business as usual, and as winter fast approached, Violet knew that it was time she started planning for the big occasion. Other than Lindsay, nobody else knew about her inheritance. She planned on keeping it that way until the time was right, and then she would break the news to them. Every now and then, her mind would drift off to her older siblings, who married when she was still young and had moved away. She felt that they too had a right to the inheritance, but she hadn't been in touch with any of them since they left town. Where then would she begin to look for them? Her thoughts then went to her husband. Lately, she'd noticed that he appeared somewhat withdrawn, which was unlike him. Though he didn't voice it out loud, she wondered whether her new status could be the reason. She knew well of the insecurities he harbored after what his first wife did to him, and he could be feeling as if she could do the same thing to him now that she was wealthy. Or could he be still angry about what she had earlier said about Luke? She needed to find out what was eating him up as soon as possible, she concluded. Later that evening after dinner and the kids had been safely tucked in bed, Violet and her husband sat at their favorite spot by the fireplace. Storm sat silently, staring intently at the fire, lost in thought, and Violet was now convinced that her intuition had been right. "My love, is there something wrong?" she asked, and placed her hand on his knee. "No. Why do you ask?" Storm said. "I can tell that something has been bothering you for quite a while now," Violet replied. Her husband sighed resignedly and took his wife's hand in his. "You know me so well, my love," he started. "I'm worried that people will think I'm a kept man when they learn of your inheritance. Even the bank manager looked at you with more respect, and he did me," Storm said, and Violet was taken aback. She hadn't been wrong in her thinking, but it was very unusual to see her husband that vulnerable. "We don't have to say anything to them if it will make you uncomfortable," Violet said as she looked into his eyes. "No, never mind me." "I don't know what has come over me," he replied. "I know what it is. You think that I might lose my respect for you because of the money. You couldn't be more wrong," Violet said, smiling at her husband to reassure him. "I know you wouldn't do that to me or to our family. Let's forget I mentioned any of this," Storm said, now beginning to feel silly for having thought so poorly of his wife. "I know Dorothy taking off with the wealthy traveling merchant shattered you to the core. No amount of money would ever make me leave your side. I hope you know that," Violet said, and Storm nodded his understanding. That night, as she lay next to her husband, Violet prayed that she'd managed to allay all of his fears. Storm had always prided himself on being an excellent provider, and she had no intention of making him feel any lesser. Lindsay rode the cart slowly as she headed to Violet's house. She was lucky that Eric had taken the day off, and he'd been more than happy to babysit their kids. After a lot of thinking, she had decided to let Violet know that her brother Robert was on his way to Colorado to spend the holidays with them. As she approached the driveway, Lindsay thought of how she'd betrayed her friend's trust, and the same hopeless feelings of regret and shame came flooding back. She hoped that Violet would never find out about it, and prayed as well that Robert would keep his mouth shut throughout his visit. She came to a stop near the front door and climbed down. She was always in awe of the beautiful house Storm had built for his wife. Storm and Violet had moved out of the family ranch house in a huff after the disagreement with his brothers over Violet. To everyone's surprise, the two had managed to build their house within a period of short time and quickly settled in. There had been whispers around town that Violet is the one who had provided money for the construction, but the couple had steered clear of the gossip, leaving everyone in suspense. She knocked softly on the door and she could hear some footsteps coming down the hallway. "Lindsay, how nice to see you. Come in," Violet exclaimed when she opened the door to see her dear friend standing there. "I've been thinking of coming over for a visit." "It looks like I beat you to it," Lindsay answered, and they both laughed. As they walked down the hallway leading to the living room, Lindsay noticed how quiet the house was. "It's awfully quiet in here. Where is everyone?" Lindsay asked after Violet had shown her to a seat. "Storm is running errands in Denver and the children are still asleep," Violet answered. "Would you like some coffee?" "No thanks. I already had some before I left the house," Lindsay answered, and Violet could see that there was something on her mind. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Oh yes, I just have a lot on my mind. My brother Robert is on his way to Colorado as we speak. He'll be spending Christmas here with us," Lindsay answered. "Your long-lost brother. I had no idea you two had reconnected," Violet said, truly happy for her friend. "Yes, we did a while back," Lindsay said. "Why don't you look happy then? I would give anything to be reunited with my siblings," Violet said. "It's been so long, Violet, and I don't know how I will react when I see him," Lindsay sighed. It was now hitting her that she had no idea who Robert was. All she knew was what he had told her in his letters. A cold, uneasy feeling settled at the pit of her stomach, and she thought she was going to be sick. "Relax, Lindsay. It will be okay," Violet said. She then rose and walked over to her and hugged her. Lindsay felt tears begin to well in her eyes, and she blinked hard. She didn't deserve all this kindness from her friend. Chapter 10. On the eve of his departure, Robert couldn't fall asleep as he was overcome with excitement. All he could think about was what he would find in Colorado. Of course, seeing his sister again after such a long time apart was a plus, but that wasn't his biggest motivation. Maybe he could have asked one of his gambler friends to travel with him. That way, it would have been easier for them to quickly come up with his hideous plan for Violet and Storm. But that would have meant that he had to share the loot with his accomplice, and he wasn't having that. Different thoughts raced through his mind before he finally fell asleep, late into the night. Robert startled from his sleep, and he jumped out of bed in a panic. How long had he been asleep? Could he have missed the train? He worried as he rushed to the window, rubbing his bleary eyes with the back of his hand. He moved the curtain to the side, and to his relief, it was still dark outside with only a few people walking up and down the deserted street. He walked back to his bed, bent down next to it, and pulled out his single suitcase from under it. He'd already packed everything he deemed important, which wasn't much. He double-checked once again, and then walked to the tiny bathroom and took a quick bath. He couldn't wait to leave this place. Bright light was now streaming in through the window, and he knew in a short while his taxi baggie would arrive to take him to the train station. He'd hired it with the extra money Lindsay had sent him, as he didn't want any of his friends to see him as he left. He made sure that he had everything ready before walking back to the window and stared outside. From his position, he would be able to see the baggie as it approached from the opposite direction. Everything around Los Angeles now looked old and dated to him. This was the only place he'd ever known, and now that he was leaving it, he didn't have a single ounce of regret in him. Shortly afterward, he saw the taxi baggie approach, and he quickly gathered his luggage and walked out of the door without a second glance. As he passed Paul's office, he thought of going in, but he knew that the man hadn't left his house yet. That was too bad, as he would have wanted to rub in his landlord's face that he was really leaving. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan. Do you need help with the rest of your luggage?" The driver, a tall, skinny man named Jake, asked, assuming that Robert had more luggage upstairs. "Good morning, Jake. No, this is the only luggage I have with me," Robert answered, ignoring the surprised look on the other man's face. "Well then, we should be on our way if we hope to make it to the station in time," Jake said as he climbed up in front and Robert settled at the back. "Say, Jake, how soon do you expect us to be there?" Robert asked. He'd walked on foot when he'd gone to purchase his ticket, and it had taken him roughly 45 minutes to get there. It should then be much less on the taxi baggie. "We should be there in about 20 minutes, sir." "Fret not, you will catch your train on time," Jake answered as he tugged gently on the reins again, and they picked up a faster pace. Soon they arrived at the train station, and Jake made a big show of unloading Robert's single suitcase from the baggie. "Thank you, Jake. This is for you," Robert said as he reached into his coat pocket and removed some money. He handed it to Jake, who broke into a wide smile and quickly stashed the money in his pants pocket. "Do have a safe trip, Mr. Morgan," he said as he climbed back into his baggie and rode out of the station. Robert picked up his lone suitcase and walked towards the train's open doors. As he approached, the conductor was busy ushering the other travelers into the train, and Robert quickly followed suit. The interior was warm, and it's only then did he realize how cold it was outside. He chose a seat next to the window so he could have a better view as they left California behind. The seat looked comfortable enough, but the suitcase was getting in the way. He looked around to see where the other passengers were placing their luggage. It was under their seats mostly, and he promptly did the same. As the last of the travelers boarded the train, he fumbled in a panic inside his coat pocket, trying to locate his ticket. To his relief, the small piece of paper was safely inside. A few minutes later, the train slowly made its way out of Los Angeles, and as they left the city behind, Robert was overcome with sadness. But the moment passed as soon as it had started. There was nothing for him back there anymore. He saw the conductor begin to walk down the aisle as he checked everyone's ticket. He hadn't had much sleep the night before, and he could barely keep his eyes open. As soon as Robert had his ticket checked, he leaned back on the headrest and closed his eyes. Chapter 11. Eric listened as his wife laid bare all of her fears to him. As her brother's arrival date approached, Lindsay was becoming more and more restless, and her husband wished there was a way he could calm her down. He didn't understand why she thought the worst of her brother. They hadn't seen each other for years, and it was possible that the old Robert was gone, and in his place was a new and better person. "You will still go with me to pick him up from the train station?" Lindsay asked her husband for the 100th time. "Yes, honey, I will go with you," Eric answered. "Try to relax in the meantime. You'll lose your mind if you keep thinking about the same thing." "I can't help it. He left me alone when our parents died. I find it hard to believe that he's turned over a new leaf. I feel as if his biggest interest in coming here is about what I so foolishly told him about Violet," Lindsay said, the pain in her eyes evident. "Be that the case, I'm sure it won't be that easy for him to get his hands on either the money or the gold," Eric stressed. "I would never say never, love," Lindsay sighed. "Enough of this topic now, Lindsay," Eric said. He didn't want to think of what could be shall his wife's premonitions come true. How he wished she'd kept her mouth shut. "I wish Mrs. Anderson was still here with us. She would have known what to do," Lindsay said after a brief moment of silence. "I know, love, but she isn't. I think a lot about her sometimes as well. What if you told Violet the truth? Maybe that way she would be extra careful when Robert arrives, though I don't understand why you're worrying this much," Eric offered. But Lindsay shot him a fierce look instead. "What? This is something I never want her to find out. How can I then go to her and confess everything?" She glared at her husband. "I thought that would make you feel better," he answered. The next 2 days were the toughest for Lindsay. She kept thinking perhaps Eric was right and she should warn Violet about Robert before he arrived. But where would she start? She had betrayed her trust to begin with. Their friendship would never be the same again. Whichever way she looked at it, she was doomed. The only hope she clung to was that her brother was truly a changed man. She longed to talk to either Minnie or Eileen, but knew that was out of the question. They too didn't know about Violet's windfall. Robert was arriving in 2 days. She still hadn't told her children that their long-lost uncle was coming to visit. She would tell them that evening after dinner so that they weren't shocked when he finally arrived. Young Robert listened carefully as his mother told him about his uncle who had the same name as he. It was hard for him to understand why he'd never met this particular uncle. His other uncles were always coming over to their house to see his father. He'd had no idea before that he had another one who lived far away at a place called Los Angeles. All this was very confusing to him. "Is he going to stay with us forever?" he asked. "No, Robert, your uncle will go back to his home after Christmas," she answered. "Who does he stay with?" he asked, catching his mother by surprise. She realized that she too knew very little about her brother. "He lives alone," she said. "He must be lonely up there alone." "Why can't he stay with us?" Robert asked, and this time the question was directed at his father, who was playing with Becky. "Yes, Papa?" "Why don't we ask him when he arrives?" Eric replied, not knowing what else to say. "Can we, Mama?" Robert said to his mother with pleading eyes. "Yes, honey, we will definitely ask him," she agreed as she exchanged a knowing glance with her husband. "When is he coming?" Robert asked. His curiosity had been roused, and he couldn't wait to meet his uncle. "We're going to fetch him tomorrow morning from the train station," Lindsay answered, and her son's eyes grew wide with excitement. "I can't wait to see him, Mama," Robert exclaimed, and his parents laughed. "You will have all the time to ask him anything you want," Eric said from where he sat with Becky. The rest of the night, Robert wouldn't talk about anything else apart from his uncle. He still didn't understand why his other uncle couldn't live at the ranch like the others did. Lindsay tossed and turned in bed as she thought of what awaited her the following day. The last time she'd seen her brother, he was dirty and unkempt, and without a place to call home. He wouldn't listen to their parents, and they in turn wouldn't let him into their home if he wasn't willing to change his ways. That image kept flashing in front of her eyes, and she wondered how he looked now. She hadn't expected her son to be that excited to learn that he had another uncle. What if Robert became attached to his uncle only to get hurt in the end? Her husband didn't look alarmed at all, and she willed her heart to calm down as. Emma still hadn't written back to her, and this only served to heighten her anxiety. If only she had written back and answered the questions she had for her, she wouldn't be suffering as she was now. It was late into the night when she finally fell asleep, but she would startle every now and then from her sleep to find her whole body drenched in sweat. The only other time she had suffered like this was when her parents passed away. Chapter 12. Robert stretched his aching limbs as he stared out of the window. They'd been traveling for 3 days, and the journey had been uneventful. This was the furthest he'd ever traveled, and the experience had been eye-opening. All his life, he'd grown up surrounded by the hustle and bustle of a big city, and he was now quite surprised that there were places where people were laid back and relaxed as they went about their business. The conductor announced that the next stop would be in Denver, Colorado, and Robert could hear his heart pounding loudly in his chest with anticipation. Lindsay and her husband would be waiting for him at the station. He would have preferred that only his sister came to pick him up, so he could grill her more about Violet before they arrived back at the house. Still, it didn't matter. He would find a way to get all the information he needed from his sister once he settled down. He didn't realize he had a sly smile on his lips until an elderly lady seated across the aisle stared at him strangely. He shot her a mean look, and she quickly turned away. She didn't look in his direction again for the rest of the day. As he shut his eyes that last night on the train, Robert couldn't wait for dawn to break so that the next time he woke up, he would be in Denver. A sudden commotion jolted Robert from his sleep, and he woke up to find his fellow passengers walking up and down the aisle, talking amongst themselves. He could tell that the train was no longer moving, and when he looked outside, it was pitch dark. What could have happened? He wondered as he got up and walked towards the front of the train where the conductor stood, talking with the driver. "Say, what's going on? Why have we stopped?" he asked the young conductor. "It seems like there was an avalanche last night, and now the tracks are covered with snow and ice. We'll have to hunker down until we can send for help," he answered. "How long would we have to wait?" Robert asked. "It could be a day or more, sir. I really don't know for sure," the young man shrugged. "What? We can't just wait here for that long," Robert snapped, and the young lad turned to him unfazed. "What would you suggest we do, kind sir?" he asked, and the sarcasm in his voice wasn't lost to Robert. "I say we rally all the men on this train and use our hands if we have to." "I have to be in Denver in the morning," he shot back. Luckily, a gentleman who was seated close to where the conversation was taking place overheard Robert, and he walked up to them. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help but listen in to what you two are talking about. I agree with him," he said, pointing at Robert. "I'm a businessman, and I will be wasting a lot of time sitting here waiting for help. Why don't we try doing this ourselves? You see, this gentleman thinks like I do. We can't afford to sit and wait. It might even not be as hard as you think," Robert said, and his fellow passenger nodded his agreement. "Okay, I will see if the other passengers are willing to do it. If they refuse, then we'll have no choice but to wait," the conductor said as he went to persuade the other men on the train. It didn't take long before the young man came back with a group of anxious-looking gentlemen. It seemed none wanted to wait, as the conductor had suggested. "Do you have lanterns?" Roberts asked, and the conductor rushed to speak with the driver. Shortly afterward, he came back with 3 lanterns and handed them to the men. They walked outside to the tracks, and it was apparent that the damage wasn't as bad as the conductor had earlier assumed. It was only a small section that was covered by a thin layer of snow, a bit of debris and ice. "We can do this. Let's use whatever we can find on the ground," Robert said, and the men went to work. The train driver and his conductor joined in to help, and since it was still a bit dark, even with the help of the flashlights, they worked at a painstakingly slow pace, but they weren't about to give up. It was almost dawn when they had cleared enough space for them to pass through. They were all tired but happy that their journey could continue. When they went back inside the train, they were greeted by loud cheers from the women and the elderly gentlemen who weren't strong enough to help. "Thank you, sir. We would have wasted a lot of time were it not for you," the conductor said to Robert. "I'm happy I could be of help," Robert said, grinning from ear to ear. This was the first time someone was thanking him for something good he'd done. It was a pity he wasn't doing it from the goodness of his heart. He imagined all the time they would have wasted waiting for help while he could use that time to get his gold and money. They arrived in Denver on the 4th day as promised, even though they were a few hours behind due to the unfortunate incident. Word had already arrived at the station earlier that the train would be delayed, so as not to cause panic among the many friends and relatives waiting to welcome their loved ones back home. Robert stepped out of the train, and immediately white flakes of snow started falling gently to the ground. He'd managed to arrive just when winter was setting in. He looked around the sea of people rushing to hug their loved ones, but he couldn't spot any familiar face. Could they have forgotten he was arriving today? He clutched his suitcase tightly and walked towards the platform to shield himself from the falling snow. Chapter 13. "There he is," Lindsay said as she held on tightly to her husband's arm, as she pointed at a tall gentleman walking towards the platform with her free hand. "Well, let's go and meet him," Eric said as he made as if to take a step forward, but his wife stood rooted to the ground. "Lindsay, you can't fall apart now. Let's go." Reluctantly, Lindsay walked beside her husband as they made their way through the crowd and caught up to Robert as he was about to go up the steps. "Robert?" Lindsay called out, and the tall, thin figure in front of them swiftly turned around. For a second, their eyes locked, and before she knew it, Lindsay had walked into her brother's open arms. Lindsay, you look very nice. I'm so happy to see you, Robert answered, as he held his younger sister tightly. For a fleeting second, a tender feeling coursed through him, seeing his sister after so many years, but he quickly brushed it away. Robert? It was all Lindsay could say, and then she began sobbing, her shoulders shaking violently. Seeing him now, all the feelings she'd been harboring disappeared, and all that mattered was the man holding her. He was her dear brother. Lindsay, please stop crying, Robert pleaded as he held her, but she only sobbed harder. He stopped talking and just held her until she calmed down. All this time, Eric stood quietly next to his wife, his heart breaking from her pain. He had no idea that Lindsay loved her brother this much, and he could only imagine how hard it had been for her to not have seen him for so many years. It brought back the suffering his family went through when Luke was trapped in his vices and he wouldn't agree to come back home. I didn't mean to behave this way. How rude of me, Lindsay said when her tears subsided. Robert, this is my husband Eric, and Eric, this is my dear brother Robert. It's very nice to meet you, Robert said as he and Eric shook hands. It's very nice to meet you too, Robert, Eric answered as he sized up his brother-in-law. He didn't like the way his eyes darted around, especially when he spotted a traveler carrying expensive-looking luggage. Robert, too, was busy analyzing his sister and her husband. Lindsay looked better than he'd expected, and it was obvious that she led a comfortable life. The clothes she and her husband wore looked expensive, and he immediately became jealous again. Why did she have to be the one living the good life all the time? He fumed. He deserved a break as well. Robert? Eric called again. Huh? Robert replied, jolted back to the present. I said you must be tired from the journey, Eric said. Oh, it wasn't anything I couldn't handle, he replied. Even so, we should get you home so you can freshen up and have something to eat, Eric said. Yes, that sounds great, he replied. All right, our cart is on the other side of the street. If you'll follow us, Eric said as he took his wife's hand and they began walking through the crowd. As he followed behind them, Robert studied his surroundings. Denver wasn't a big town like Los Angeles, but it had a life of its own. He could see a bank, a grocery store, a mercantile, as well as a postal exchange office. He could see a few well-dressed men and women going about their business, even though the majority wore pants and checked shirts. He instantly felt out of place in his gray suit, complete with a hat. Here we are, Eric said. He pulled out a bandana from his pocket and wiped flakes of snow from both the front and back benches of the cart. He then helped his wife up on the front. Don't worry about me. I have used one of these before, Robert said as he placed his suitcase on the back bench and effortlessly jumped in. I see you'll fit right in with us just fine, Eric joked. That I will. The only thing you'll have to teach me is how to ride a horse, he replied, and Eric laughed. Fret not. You've come to the right place, he replied. They rode on in silence, and all this time Lindsay hadn't uttered a single word. Her heart was conflicted. She had been overcome with joy when she saw Robert, but the fear she had before was still there. The clothes he wore looked brand new, as if he'd waited for the money she sent him to buy them. The suitcase he carried was old, as if he'd borrowed it from a friend. To her, he looked like the same old person, albeit this time clad in new clothes. She had expected to see a whole new person from what he'd written in his letters, but that's not who she was seeing. Could this be the reason why Emma hadn't written back? She could have been scared to tell Lindsay that Robert was still the same person she knew. You're awfully quiet, Lindsay, Robert said from his seat at the back. I'm thinking of all the questions I will ask you later about California, she answered, feigning a smile. Don't worry, I will answer all of them, he said. I meant to ask earlier, have you seen Emma around? She asked. No, is she still in Los Angeles? He asked. Yes, the last time we spoke, she still lived there. Do you know she came out here to visit me a few years ago? She asked. She had just caught him in his first lie. Of course, he knew Emma still lived in Los Angeles. That's great. I had no idea, he replied in a bored tone. It was clear that he didn't wish to continue with the conversation. Chapter 14. As they turned into the driveway, Robert couldn't help but admire the big house his sister lived in. All this time, he had thought that his sister was living from hand to mouth, but now he could see how wrong he was. Not only was the house large, it was well kept, and as he followed his hosts down the hallway, he was reminded how good life was when he was younger and had no care in the world. He shrugged the nostalgic feeling away as he was led into a well-furnished living room and shown to a seat. "Where are my nephew and niece?" he asked. "My older brother Storm and his wife Violet were kind enough to look after them when we came to fetch you," Eric replied. "I can't wait to meet them," Robert said. "I will pick them up later in the afternoon. They're both eager to meet you, especially our eldest son, Robert," Eric said with pride in his voice. Lindsay walked into the room, and they both turned to her. "Robert, I will show you to your room now," she said. "It's about time. I'm worn out, and I might lie down for a while after I freshen up," he said as a yawn escaped him. "That's all right. Dinner won't be until 6 in the evening," Lindsay answered as he led him up the stairs. When the siblings walked out of the room, Eric couldn't get the nagging feeling that Lindsay had been right about her brother out of his mind. Something about his demeanor was unsettling. He'd noticed how his shifty eyes had swept over all the valuables in the living room. But he wouldn't dare steal from his sister, now would he? It was now clear to Eric that Robert was still the same man Lindsay had told him about, and everything about him being a changed man was a ruse. "How do you like the room?" Lindsay asked her brother after she'd finished showing him around. "It reminds me of my old room back at home," he answered with a smile. "Is that a bad or a good thing?" Lindsay asked with a frown. "Oh, it's a good thing, Lindsay. I miss those times terribly," he replied. "I miss them too. If only there was a way we could turn back the clock." Lindsay sighed, and Robert walked over to her and hugged her. She was taken aback because as far as she could remember, Robert was never affectionate with her. "Don't worry, as we now have each other," he said. "I will leave you to it then." "Just come downstairs when you're ready," Lindsay told Robert before she turned and walked out of the room. Left alone, Robert went to the window, pushed the elegant curtains a little further to the side, and stared at the vast lands surrounding the house. Most of them now had a thin blanket of snow covering them, and even he had to admit that the sight was breathtaking. He could see the outline of a rooftop, and he wondered which brother owned that house. Soon, he would meet all of them, even the one Lindsay had told him was a reformed gambler. He walked back to the bed and run his hands over the fresh-smelling linen. He couldn't believe this was where he would be sleeping for the next couple of weeks. Had he known his sister was living such a life, he would have looked for her earlier. It didn't matter, though. He was here now, and that's all that mattered. Lindsay walked back into the living room to find her husband in deep thought. She went to him and placed a hand on his shoulder, startling him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked as she joined him on the couch. "I have had this feeling since we picked up Robert from the station that your worries were well-founded," he said. "What made you feel that way?" she asked, and she listened intently as he told her about everything he'd noticed. "Do you think he would do you harm?" Eric asked afterward. "I don't think so, but I'm afraid he's capable of hurting those close to me," she answered. Pros 7%. "Or we could be worrying over nothing," he said. "I hope so. I really hope so," she answered. "I will let Storm know that Robert has arrived when I go to pick up Robert and Becky," Eric said. "That's fine. I plan on informing Violet very soon as well," she said. When Robert woke up, the room was almost dark and he realized that he had overslept. If only he wasn't so famished, he wouldn't have bothered to go downstairs. He pulled himself out of bed and got dressed. He hoped Lindsay and Eric wouldn't notice how worn out his clothes were. As he went down the stairs, he could hear animated chatter coming from the living room, which would be broken occasionally by happy giggles. The kids were back at home. He'd never thought of having his own, and he didn't want them either. But it would be interesting to see the ones Lindsay had brought forth. "There he is!" Lindsay exclaimed as soon as Robert walked into the room. Becky stood up and ran to him, while young Robert only stared at him warily from where he sat. "Who is this beautiful girl?" Robert asked as he picked up the child. "That's Becky," Lindsay answered. Becky thought maybe she didn't want to be carried and struggled to be placed on the floor. "Robert, come and say hello to your uncle." Young Robert walked cautiously towards his uncle as he took in every inch of him. While his other uncles were tall and strong, this one was very thin and his grin scared him. His clothes looked old and he could see they didn't fit him well. He had waited eagerly to see him, but now he was scared of even going close to him. Chapter 15. We should invite Lindsay, Eric, and Robert for dinner soon. It would be a good chance to get to know him, Storm told Violet the night after Robert's arrival. "I agree. We should get to know him before the get-together," she answered. "She must be excited to see him again after years of being apart," Storm went on. "I can only imagine how happy she must feel," Violet said, and Storm picked up on the sadness in her voice. "I wish we knew where we could start searching for your siblings," he said. "I know, love, they left us a long time ago that I doubt even my late father would have known where to find them," she answered. "It's very sad," he sighed. He could imagine how desperate he would be if he lost contact with any of his brothers. "Don't worry, I've already made peace with it. I have you as my family now," she answered, smiling reassuringly at him. 2 days passed, and Lindsay felt that it was time to confront her brother about the misgivings she had about him. Since Robert arrived, he'd been on his best behavior helping around the house, and Lindsay began to think that maybe she could have been wrong about him. Since the errand boy had brought Violet's message that she was inviting them for dinner the following evening, she felt that she couldn't take Robert there without knowing about his intentions. "Robert, could you join me on the porch when you're done?" she told him as he watered the flower bed. "Of course, Lindsay. Is something the matter?" he asked without looking up. "Not quite. I just thought we should discuss a small matter is all," she answered. "That's okay. I will be right with you," he answered. Lindsay made sure the children were okay in Becky's bedroom, and then went out to the porch to wait for her brother. It was a chilly morning as it had snowed a bit the night before, but it wasn't uncomfortable. She had 2 steaming mugs of coffee, and she kept sipping on hers nervously as she waited for Robert to join her. "Let's hear it," Robert said as soon as he sat opposite her. She pushed his mug toward him as she searched for the right words to start the conversation. "Robert, I hope you know that I'm very happy you're here with me," she said, and he smiled. "Yes, I do. I'm happy to be here too with you," he answered. "Why didn't you come home when our parents died?" she asked after a brief pause, the events of that day still vivid in her mind. "I couldn't, Lindsay. I wasn't in Los Angeles then," he lied. "I know you were around Robert, but you chose to hide. Emma told me everything when she came to visit," she answered. "I'm sorry I lied to you, Lindsay. I couldn't show my face at the time. I was riddled with shame and guilt," he said in a sad tone. "You should have come regardless. You're my older brother, and I was just a child. I really needed your support during that tough time," she said. "I apologize wholeheartedly. I was a different person then, but now I've managed to turn my life around. I'll always be there for you," he said. "This brings me to my other question. Are you sure you've let go of all of your vices?" she asked. "I assure you that I'm a changed person. I'll prove it to you with time," he said. "I have a wonderful family here, and I wouldn't want to see them hurt in any way," she said, her eyes trained on him. "I wouldn't do anything like that to you. Not when you've all been so kind to me," he said, and reached for his sister's hand. "I'm a changed man, Lindsay. Please trust in me." "Okay, Robert, you're my brother, and I know you'd never hurt me or the people I love," she said. "And you're right, I couldn't do that to you. I regret very much to have left you alone when you really needed me." "Let me make it up to you now," he said in his most believable voice, and he could tell that his sister was taken hook, line, and sinker. "Eric's older brother Storm has invited us over to their house tomorrow evening for dinner." "Well, not quite him, but his wife Violet," she said. "What's the occasion?" Robert asked nonchalantly. "It's in your honor. They want to meet you and also get to know a little bit more about you," Lindsay answered. "That's great news. I'd love to meet them too. I want to meet all the people who so graciously welcomed you into their lives when you had nobody," he said. Robert couldn't believe what he was hearing. Everything was coming together fast and sooner than he'd expected. Since he arrived in Denver, all he wanted to do was visit Storm's house to see what else was there. He had patiently listened to his sister's sob story, but he was in the least bit moved. Even now, he was still resentful of how good life had turned out for her. He was here for only one thing, and he would get it if it was the last thing he did. He would be on his best behavior the following evening and the days after until he gained all their trust. Then, when they least expect it, he would strike and then disappear from their lives. He now began to seriously think that he should have looked for an extra pair of hands in order to execute his mission successfully. But when he thought of splitting his fortune with another person, he felt it was best that he acted alone. Chapter 16. It was the evening of the dinner at Violet and Storm's house. Robert chose to wear the suit he had on when he arrived in Denver, hoping that it would give him a decent look. He walked to the mirror and scrutinized himself from head to toe, and he liked what he saw. As he made his way down to the living room, the house was very quiet, and he remembered that the children had been taken to another of Storm's brothers, Luke, and his wife Minnie's house for the night. Storm's children would also be spending the night at Luke's house, he'd been told. Wasn't Luke the reformed gambler who was to marry Violet? Robert mused. This was an interesting family indeed. Robert, you look very nice, Lindsay gushed when her brother walked into the room. Thank you, dear sister, but you're the one who will be the star of the night. Isn't it true, Eric? Robert said, directing his question at his brother-in-law, who was seated next to his wife. I couldn't agree more, Eric said. He took his wife's gloved hand and brushed his lips lightly against it. Enough with the flattery, you two. We should get going, Lindsay said with a smile. She couldn't help but thank her lucky stars that the two most important men in her life were in the same room with her. Eric picked up the thick coat laid out on an armchair next to him and helped his wife into it. They then all walked out of the house and into the coach that Eric had hired for the evening. Is everyone okay back there? The coachman asked from his position at the front. Eric sat on one side in the warm interior of the coach with his wife by his side, while Robert sat on the opposite side facing them. Yes, we are, Eric answered, and with that they started moving at a slow speed until a minute later when they picked up a moderate pace. I'm a little nervous to meet your oldest brother, Eric, Robert said, breaking the brief silence. Don't be. Storm is one of the best people you'll ever meet. Violet is a darling as well, Eric replied. Thank you. That does allay some of my fears, Robert smiled. He couldn't wait to get over with the so-called dinner. Some things were just not for him, but he had to pretend until the end. They're eagerly waiting and happy to finally meet you, Robert, Lindsay said. She had been talking about her long-lost brother for such a long time that she was only too happy to have her new family meet him. Violet fussed around the dining table trying to make sure everything was in its right place. She would then dash into the kitchen to check on the food, and then come back to the table and start wiping imaginary dust from the table as well as the seats. Storm watched with a smile from his favorite armchair. Violet, slow down. It all looks very clean and presentable, he said. I have to be sure, love. We are meeting Robert for the first time, and I want to leave a good impression, she answered. When have you ever left a bad one? You're the most organized and neat person I know, he said. You're only saying that because you're my husband, she smiled at him. Wait, what is that? What? Storm asked. I think I can hear a coach driving into our driveway, Violet answered as she rushed to the window and peeped outside. They are here. Well, we're ready for them, aren't we? Storm said. I think we are, Violet said, a hint of doubt evident in her voice. Here we are, Eric said as he disembarked and then helped his wife to the ground. It was a cold evening and Lindsay pulled the coat around herself tightly. It's a beautiful house they have here, Robert said as he looked at the imposing ranch house standing before them in awe. That it is, Eric answered, thinking to himself that was an odd observation for Robert to make. Lynch. Lindsay knocked on the door and almost immediately the door swung open and a smiling Violet stood inside. Lindsay, it's so nice to see you all. Please get out of this freezing weather, she said warmly, and then turned and led them down the hallway leading into the living room. Storm stood up as they walked inside, a welcoming smile on his lips. Storm, it's so nice to see you this evening. This is my elder brother, Robert, Lindsay said, and then turned to her brother. Robert, this is my brother-in-law, Storm, and his lovely wife, Violet. Robert turned to Violet, tipped his hat to her, and said, "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Violet," he said in his sincerest voice. "Storm and I are happy to have you in our home," she replied. Robert then turned to Storm and said, "It's a pleasure to meet you too, Storm," he said, and the men shook hands. "The pleasure is all ours. Please, all of you have a seat," Storm said. As they were being shown to their seats, Eric's mind was racing. He thought Robert was trying too hard to impress the hosts, but neither Violet nor Storm seemed to notice. Another voice in his head was telling him that maybe he was reading too much into the situation. He hadn't known this man for long and therefore wasn't in a position to judge him that harshly. He walked to his seat and tried to push the disturbing thoughts to the back of his mind. Chapter 17. Dinner was a quiet affair, with everyone at the table lost in their thoughts. Every now and then, one of them would comment about how delicious the food was and then fall back into silence. When they were done, Lindsay, Eric, and Robert went to sit on the couch while Violet and Storm were left clearing up the table. Shortly afterward, Violet served each of them a mug of steaming coffee, and then she and her husband went to sit on the other couch. "Robert, how are you finding Denver thus far?" Storm asked. "I thought I would be bored stiff coming here, but to my surprise, I'm beginning to like this place very much," Robert answered, and then took a sip of his coffee. "I'm not at all surprised. Everyone coming from out east seems to think there isn't much life out here. But when they eventually get here, most of them never want to leave," Storm replied. "You're very right. I can see myself settling here for the rest of my days," Robert said, eliciting a huge smile from his sister. "Is that so, Robert? You haven't mentioned anything to me," she said. "I was waiting for the right time to tell you," he answered, and Lindsay nodded her understanding. "In that case, you're welcome to stay with us until you get on your feet. What would you want to do for a living?" Eric asked. Could he have been misjudging this man all this time? "Back home, our parents ran a general store that was one of the best in town. I learned a lot from them, and I would love to own one someday," Robert said. Lindsay was taken aback by that statement. Why was Robert lying? Ever since she could remember, Robert had never shown interest in their parents' business. "For that, you'd need some capital," Storm said. "Yes, Storm, you're right, and that's why I was thinking you could give me a job here at your ranch," he said, and an audible gasp escaped from both Lindsay and Eric. "I could have easily offered you a job at my ranch," Eric said, and Robert smiled. "I know, but you've already given me accommodation. I would be asking for too much," Robert answered without batting an eyelid. "It's okay, Eric. I can find Robert something to do around here. After all, it's only for a short while until he can set up his general store," Storm said. "It's a great idea, Robert, and we're happy to help," Violet said. "When would you like to start?" "There isn't much to do now with all the snow, but there's always something," Storm said. "I can start on Monday if that's okay with you," Robert answered. "Then Monday it is," Storm agreed. On the way back to Eric's ranch, the silence inside the coach was deafening. Eric glanced at his wife and realized that she was seething with anger, and he understood why. Robert had jumped the gun being that bold with Storm when he'd asked to work at the ranch. Now more than ever, Eric was convinced that Robert had an ulterior motive for coming to Denver, but he had no idea how he could prove it. "Robert, I think you should have consulted with my husband and me before speaking to Storm. That was too forward of you," Lindsay said, trying to sound as respectable as possible. He was her older brother, after all. "Lindsay, did I offend you and Eric because that wasn't my intention?" Robert asked, feigning ignorance. "No, but I think that we should have talked about this at home before taking it to Storm," Lindsay answered, feeling as if she had overreacted. Robert always had a way of manipulating a person into thinking they're the ones in the wrong. Storm knew I needed capital if I'm to set up my general store anytime soon, and he was only too happy to help. I don't see what the problem is. Like I said earlier, you've already done enough for me, and I couldn't as well burden you with this issue, Robert said. And the more he talked, the more Lindsay doubted herself. It's okay, Robert. It's good that you'll be working for Storm. I couldn't have chosen anyone better to work for. Eric broke his silence. He had the same fears as his wife, but he wasn't going to voice them at this time. If it was true Robert was targeting Violet's gold, then he would have a hard time getting to it, as Eric was sure that it was securely stored somewhere far from the house. Lindsay, it hurts me deeply that you think so poorly of me. I'm not the same person I was before, and you need to believe that. I plan to work, save up, and eventually open my store. Or would you rather I went back home and ease your fears? Robert asked, sounding hurt, and Lindsay's heart melted. I'm very sorry if that's how I've come across. Of course, I'm happy that you'll be staying in Denver, and I don't want you to leave. Forgive me, she said. It's okay, Lindsay. I fully understand why you'd think that way. I haven't been the best role model to you, and I also apologize, Robert said and reached for his sister's hand. You have nothing to worry about, dear. That night, while he lay in his bed, Robert couldn't believe how easy it was all coming together. His sister and her husband almost spoilt the first step, but as always, he'd been able to turn everything in his favor. How brilliant was he to make them believe that he planned on staying in Denver? By the time he was done with them, they wouldn't know what hit them. He had no intention of being here for Christmas. He would be long gone by then, he gloated. Chapter 18. Robert threw himself into his job as he tried his best to impress Storm and his wife. He was always on time and would be the last one to leave in the evening. Before long, he had his employers in the palm of his hand. He now had the freedom to go in and out of the house, and as he did so, he would make a mental note of anything of value he saw. He would lift portraits off the wall to see if there was a safe hidden behind them, but to his dismay, there wasn't any. Still, he would scour the whole house when the owners weren't around, even going to snoop into their bedroom. After a few days of looking around and finding nothing, Robert realized that getting to the gold wasn't as easy as he had first thought. Christmas was around the corner, and he had to come up with another plan for getting what he wanted. He hadn't come all this way to fail at the last minute. He'd just finished cleaning the stables and was standing by the door when an idea came to him. Why hadn't he thought about it earlier? It was there, and then that he decided that he was going to put it into motion. He could only smile inwardly when he thought of how perfect this plan was. I think we got ourselves the right man for the job, Storm said to his wife as they sat on a couch in the living room, hot mugs of coffee clutched in their hands. Storm had noticed how neat and clean the stables, as well as the cattle enclosures, were since Robert started working for them. He's a hard worker, that one. I'm happy, too, that you gave him a chance, Violet agreed. I noticed the hesitation on Eric and Lindsay's faces when Robert asked for the job, but I now don't see what they were so worried about, Storm went on. I did notice that as well, but I think it's only because they thought you would be offended, Violet replied. Yes, I think so too. I can't wait to tell them how wrong they were. Do you think I should increase Robert's wages for the good job he's been doing? Storm queried. Yes, you should. It's always good to show appreciation whenever one can. It might also help him to open up his general store sooner than he anticipated, Violet agreed. Robert would heap praises on Storm and his wife to his sister and her husband, saying how well they treated him. As the days went by, Lindsay began to think that she'd been wrong after all about her brother. She would think of her brother-in-law, Luke, who was now a responsible and respected family man after years of being lost in his vices. The more she watched her brother, the more she felt that he was heading in the same direction as Luke. I think I might have judged Robert a little bit harshly, she said one evening as she prepared for bed with her husband. I'm also beginning to think that way. I think that you could still be traumatized by the way he abandoned you after your parents' death, that you're afraid to give him the benefit of a doubt, Eric answered. I agree, and from now onwards, I won't doubt him again, she said. Yes, if there was a problem, Storm would have let me know by now, Eric said as he blew out the lantern, plunging the room into total darkness. Good night, my love. Good night to you too, Lindsay answered. We should start buying provisions for the Christmas party soon. We only have 2 weeks left, Violet said to her husband as they rode home from the bank. Great idea, but you do remember I have to go to Boulder on business for a few days. I'm leaving tomorrow, Storm said, and Violet's eyes grew wide. Why? I've had so much on my mind lately, and I totally forgot about that trip. Isn't there a way you could postpone it? Violet asked. No, darling, I couldn't. Mr. Morse is one of my best clients, and I can't afford to lose him. You do understand, don't you? Strom asked, holding his wife's hand affectionately. I do, and don't worry about it. I can always find someone to accompany me, she replied, and smiled reassuringly at her husband. As they rode into their driveway, they saw Robert busy by the cattle enclosures. An idea hit Violet. Why don't I ask Robert to go with me? He could take the day off, she said. I hadn't thought of him. Why don't we ask him together? Storm suggested, and his wife nodded her agreement. As soon as they were on the ground, Storm waved Robert over, and he immediately left what he was doing and hurriedly walked towards them. Say, Robert, I have a huge favor to ask of you, Storm said. Of course, Storm, anything you need, Robert answered. I'm leaving town for a couple of days for business. I was wondering if you could accompany Violet to town to buy provisions for the upcoming festivities, he said. I'd be glad to. When are we supposed to go? He asked, his mind racing. 2 days from now, Storm answered. I'll be happy to, he answered, smiling from ear to ear. He watched as the couple walked into the house, and he couldn't believe how this opportunity had landed so effortlessly in his hands. This was the chance he'd been hoping for, and here it was. It helped that Storm was traveling out of town. He'd endured days of cleaning smelly piles of cow dung, swept the chicken coops with fleas sucking his blood dry, and brushing endless horse manes, waiting for an opportunity like this one. In his bed later that night, sleep eluded Robert as he ran his plan through his mind for the 100th time. He couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. Violet was a wonderful person, and it was unfortunate that she was the one who stood between him and his bright future. As in any war, there is always collateral damage, and sadly, Violet would be it this time around. Chapter 19. Violet finished getting the kids ready for their stay at Luke's house that afternoon. She and Robert were going to town afterward to buy groceries for the house and also to buy the provisions she needed for her big party. Why can't we go to town with you, Mama? Ben whined. I told you earlier that I want you and Sarah to keep an eye on the twins, Violet answered. Sarah can do that by herself. Why do I need to be there? He went on. Because you're the eldest, Ben, that's why, his mother answered. I wish I wasn't, he mumbled. Speak up, Ben. What did you say? Violet asked. Nothing, Mama, he answered. He hated going to any of his female cousins' houses as the girls always picked on him, and he didn't understand why. He was sure Anne, too, would give him a hard time that afternoon. Robert waited in the carriage for Violet to finish up getting ready as his hands trembled with excitement. The day was here, and everything was about to change for the Lucas family, as well as for him, hopefully. When he'd left his sister's house that morning, he'd known that he wasn't coming back. He didn't carry anything out of his room to avoid suspicion. Not that he cared for any. Soon, he'd be rich enough to buy anything he'd ever needed or wanted. As his thoughts ran wild, he saw Violet and the kids come out of the house and head to where the carriage was waiting. Let's hurry up. I've wasted quite some time getting the children ready. I hope to be back home by dusk, she said as Robert helped the children inside. Don't worry, Violet. We will back before you know it, Robert replied with a smile on his face. They rode the short distance to Luke's house in silence, only interrupted when Violet gave out directions to Luke's house. As the kids fussed with one another, Violet went over the shopping list in her mind and prayed that she would find everything that she needed. With the snow continuing to fall, it would soon be very hard to ride to town. All the roads would be covered in snow, and chances of getting into an accident then were very high. Here we are. Turn into that driveway, she directed, and Robert obliged. As they rode in, Robert was once again dumbstruck. While Storm's house was quite something, Luke's was imposing. He began to think that maybe he'd targeted the wrong couple, but then again, as big as Luke's house was, he didn't have any gold. Minnie came to the door as soon as Lindsay knocked, with a young boy tagging behind her. He peered nervously at the visitors before hiding his face behind his mother's skirts. "We've been waiting for you for ages," she exclaimed as she ushered all of them into the house. "And I'm sorry for keeping you waiting." "It took us a bit longer to get ready than I thought," Violet apologized. "Not to worry. You're here now," Minnie replied. "Sarah, Anne is in her room. Would you take your brothers up there?" "Yes, Auntie Minnie," Sarah replied as they all turned to go upstairs. "Archie, please go with your cousins." Minnie turned to her young son, who was still clinging to her skirts. Archie wanted to refuse, but the look on his mother's face convinced him otherwise. With a thumb stuck firmly in his mouth, he slowly went up the stairs to join the others. "Minnie, this is Robert, Lindsay's brother," she said, turning to Robert, who'd been standing quietly beside her. "It's very nice to meet you, Robert," Minnie said with a smile. "The pleasure is all mine, ma'am," Robert said, swiftly tipping his hat to her, and the women burst into peals of laughter. "You make me sound like an old lady. Please call me Minnie," she said amid the laughter. "Then Minnie it is," he answered with a smile. If there was something the Lucas brothers did well, was to marry the most beautiful women from the East, he noted. Robert, we should be on our way," Violet said when the moment passed. "Yes, we should if we hope to be back by dusk," he agreed. "Don't worry too much, Violet. If you run late, the kids can stay for the night, and you can pick them up tomorrow," Minnie offered. "Thanks, Minnie. That would be wonderful. Do give my warm regards to Luke," Violet said as she started walking towards the door. As Minnie stood at her door watching Violet and Robert walk to the carriage, a sudden feeling of foreboding overcame her. Something about Robert's demeanor didn't sit well with her. She didn't like that his eyes seemed to dart from one corner of her house to the other as they were being introduced to each other. His mind wasn't in the room with them, she could tell. She wanted to call out to her sister-in-law and ask her not to go to town that afternoon, but she knew she would have sounded crazy. What reason would she give for her worries? "Luke has quite a house, doesn't he? Not to say that Storm's isn't just as great," Robert said as they rode to town. "I think so too, and it's amazing. He's really come a long way," she answered. "Is that all from the ranch products, or—" His voice trailed off. "Oh no, Luke owns a very profitable creamery in Chicago," Violet answered as she pulled her heavy coat tighter around her body. It was becoming colder by the minute. "I didn't know that," Robert said. How could have Lindsay forgotten to mention that small detail? Here he was, thinking that Luke was just another recovering gambler and a drunkard turned rancher. He was now thinking that he might have played his cards wrong. "You haven't been here that long. Give it time, and you'll learn a lot more about this town and its people," Violet said, totally oblivious to Robert's intentions. They rode in silence for some time until some of Denver's buildings began to come into view. "Where should we start?" Robert asked as they rode down a street that was surrounded by businesses on each side. "I think we should start at the dry goods store and then finish up at the mercantile," she replied. "Oh, let's go to the postal exchange first. I'm expecting a very important letter from back home." Robert watched as Violet walked into the postal exchange, and the young man manning the counter welcomed her with a big smile. As she disappeared inside, Robert's mind went back to Luke. He really owned a creamery out east? Lindsay should have really told him about it. Chapter 20. It was fast becoming dark as Violet shopped for her last items. As she watched Robert load the last of her items in the coach, she thought that it would be a good idea to let the children spend the night at Minnie's house. "I think you should take me straight home. I'll leave the kids to spend the night with their cousins," she said. "I agree. I'm sure they're having a good time," Robert answered. "That's the last of it," she said as Robert heaved a heavy bag of beans onto the carriage. "Don't worry, we'll be home before you know it," Robert said as he helped her inside and he climbed up to his box seat. Violet settled back into the warm interiors of the carriage as she thought of how wonderful everything was coming along. This Christmas was bound to be the best one yet. Lindsay had her brother back, and he was planning to stay too. Her mind went to all the money she now had at the bank and the many things she and Storm could do with it. Something about him wasn't right, I could tell, Minnie said. She had been troubled since meeting Robert, and it was the first thing she talked to her husband about when he returned home that evening. "You don't know this man. Could you have misread him?" Luke asked. "I can't explain the feeling to you. I hope Violet is safe," she said. "Come now, my love. Of course she is. Do you really think he would harm her?" he asked. "I don't know what to think. I could be worrying over nothing," Minnie said. "I'm sure that's what it is," Luke said, and she sighed resignedly. "Let me check on the kids," she said. As she walked upstairs, Minnie stopped by a side window and pulled the curtain aside slightly. It was now pitch black outside, and a shudder ran down her spine. Was Violet back home safely? Violet startled when the carriage hit a rock, and she was shocked to realize that she had fallen asleep. She moved the small curtain slightly to the side and peered outside, but she couldn't see a thing. How long had she been asleep? She could see Robert's silhouette still perched at the front, his gaze on the road ahead. "Robert, how long have I been asleep?" she asked, raising her voice a bit so he could hear her amid the howling wind outside. "I couldn't tell, Violet," he answered without turning to look at her. "Shouldn't we have arrived home by this time?" Violet asked, beginning to become confused. "We will be there shortly," Robert curtly answered, and she thought his voice sounded cold. "Okay," she said, and then she settled back. They rode for about half an hour, and Violet now began to feel that something wasn't right. Could Robert have taken a wrong turn? The road they were traveling on was bumpy and rough, and she thought that was strange. "Robert, I think we're going the wrong way," she said, but received no reply. She thought maybe he hadn't heard her, and as she leaned forward to try again, the carriage came to an abrupt stop. She saw Robert slowly climb down, walk toward the door, and open it. "Get out," he said. "What?" she asked, thinking she'd heard him wrong. "I told you to get out. Are you hard of hearing?" He glared at her. "Robert," she said, her voice beginning to quiver. This wasn't her home, and she had no idea where she was. "Get out of the carriage, Violet," he barked as he grabbed her by the arm and yanked her outside unceremoniously. She almost missed a step when she landed on the ground, but she managed to steady herself in time. "Robert, what are you doing? Where are we?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "You'll find out soon, dear Violet," he sneered. He removed a torch from his pocket and began pushing her down a small hill. It was too dark for Violet to see anything, but he had her firmly in his grip that she didn't trip even once. At the bottom of the hill was a small shack, and Robert opened the door and pushed her inside. She landed on the hard ground with a resounding thud. "Stay there," he barked. He then turned and started walking towards the entrance. "Robert, where are you going?" she asked, but he didn't answer and continued walking. When the rickety door banged shut, Violet realized that she wasn't dreaming. The person she had trusted and had welcomed into her house was out to harm her. She just couldn't figure out why. She huddled on the cold floor and began sobbing, loud body-racking sobs as the reality of what was happening began to dawn on her. Robert struggled with the heavy carriage for a while, but he eventually managed to push it over the cliff. He could hear it as it hurtled down the side and finally hit the ground below with a loud bang. Nobody would be able to find it there. He then made his way back to the shack and walked inside. "Violet, are you awake?" he asked in a menacing voice as he shone the light in her eyes, temporarily blinding her. "Yes," she answered. "Crying won't do you any good," he said, seeing her tear-stained face. "Why are you doing this to me? I have been nothing but kind to you," she whimpered. "Oh, I have no ill feelings toward you, dear, but I need you to get what I want," he sneered. "What is it that you want?" "Storm and I could have given it to you without you having to do all this," she said as she tried to look at him, but all she could make out was a black mass staring down at her. "Really, could you have given me your money and the 5 bars of gold you inherited from your late father?" he said, and he could see the shock in her eyes. "What? How do you know about that? I only told. Her voice trailed off as everything now began to make sense. The only other person who knew about her inheritance, apart from her husband, was Lindsay. Don't look so shocked, dear Violet. Yes, Lindsay told me all about your inheritance. Why else do you think I came out here? He said, his voice as cold as ice. Violet tried to speak, but nothing came out. How could Lindsay betray her like this? She should have listened to her husband's warnings, she thought bitterly. Chapter 21. I thought you came here to visit your sister. Aren't you planning to stay and open your general store? Violet asked, trying hard to contain her shaking voice. Which sister? That spoilt brat. Ever since we were younger, she always had everything she wanted. Our parents doted on her and forgot that I, too, was their child, he spat. But you said they taught you everything you know about running a general store, she said, and he gave a sarcastic laugh. I've never been interested in that good-for-nothing business. Why would I? They'd already chosen her as their sole heir, he said, and Violet could sense the vitriol in his words. He was jealous of Lindsay and had always been. Wasn't that because you were a gambler and a... Violet began to say, but she was rudely interrupted by an irate Robert. What? Is that how ill Lindsay has been talking of me since she arrived here? I'll have you know that they're the ones who pushed me away, he thundered. Robert, Lindsay loves you very much. I saw the pain in her eyes whenever she spoke of you, she said. No, she only invited me here so she can gloat about how comfortably she lives while I live a pauper's life back in California. Well, that's all about to change. She will never look down on me ever again, he roared, startling Violet. Robert, Lindsay isn't like that, she said. Shut up. What do you know? Your father dies, and you inherit a fortune. What about the rest of us? Don't we deserve the same luck? He said as he paced up and down the tiny room. It hasn't been as easy as you might think, Robert. I've also known pain, more than you can imagine, she said, hoping to appeal to his better nature. I don't care about your pain. I only care about what I want, he hissed. I will give you anything you want. Please let me go back to my family, my poor children, she said as tears pooled in her eyes once again. Your poor children. Are you out of your mind, woman? Your children will never know what poverty looks like, what with all your money and gold and with an uncle who own a creamery. Unlike some of us, he said in such a cold, icy tone that Violet thought that he wasn't in his right mind. Tell me what you need, and it's yours, she repeated. I'm not a fool, Violet. If I let you go now, you'll run to the sheriff and I will definitely rot in jail. I don't plan on doing that. I will let you go once I have what I want, he said. Violet realized that there would be no talking sense to Robert. The man standing before her was consumed by jealousy and bitterness. She had no idea what he planned to do with her once he got what he wanted. He had already taken her reticule with the money she'd had after shopping, but she didn't care about that. Storm will be back in 4 days. He's the only one who can authorize anything. Are we going to stay here until then? She asked. I'm afraid he'll be back sooner than that unless he doesn't love you as much as he claims, he said. What do you mean? Violet asked. Your in-laws will receive a note from you saying that you need your gold bars brought to you and some money in cash. Since he's the only one who knows where all that is, he'll have to come back, he said, a mean smile on his face. It was all now coming together for Violet. Robert had been planning this for a long time. This was the main reason why he wanted to work for them. He must have thought that the gold was inside the house. The shocked looks on Lindsay and Eric's faces during that dinner evening now made sense to Violet. They, too, had no idea that he planned to ask Storm for a job. He had managed to fool everybody. Chapter 22. As the day went by, Minnie became more and more concerned for Violet. She had noticed that Luke hadn't paid much attention to her fears, but as the day went by, she could sense that something wasn't right. When evening came and Violet still hadn't come to check or pick up her children, Minnie became convinced that all was not well. She wanted to ride over to Violet's house, but she couldn't leave the children by themselves. The situation was complicated by the fact that Storm was out of town. I think we need to ride out to the ranch and check if she's there, Minnie pleaded with her husband. There must be a reason why she hasn't come. With Storm out of town, she has all the responsibilities around the ranch in her hands. It might even do her some good to have the kids with us for a few days, Luke said. He was tired and didn't feel like riding out at night with the biting cold. She could have told me if that was the case. She knows I couldn't refuse her. I'm telling you, Luke, something isn't right. What if they had an accident? Minnie said. Luke knew she wouldn't stop until he promised to do something. All right, my love, why don't I go to the house early tomorrow morning? I still feel everything is okay, but I will go so you can be at ease. Once I find her in the house, it'll be up to you to explain yourself to her later, he said with a smile. Okay, tomorrow morning is fine, Minnie answered. The following morning, as Minnie was busy preparing breakfast for Luke so he could leave for Storm's ranch, she saw a wagon ride into her driveway through her kitchen window. She immediately recognized it as one of those owned by Storm. But as she looked closer, it wasn't her friend riding in it, but one of the ranch hands. That's when her fears were confirmed. She rushed to the living room in a panic to tell her husband. Luke, something is wrong. One of Violet's ranch hands just rode into our driveway. Why else would he be here this early? She said, her voice shaking. Luke rose, walked over to his wife, and took both of her hands in his. Calm down. Let's go and find out what the young man wants, he said. They walked to the door, and as they opened it, the young man was right by the doorstep. Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Lucas. I didn't mean to bother you this early in the morning, but the other Mrs. Rank Lucas hasn't been back home since she went to Denver with Robert. Could she be here by any chance? The young man said as he nervously fiddled with his hat. What do you mean she hasn't been back since? Luke asked. What was going on? Yes, Mr. Lucas, there hasn't been anyone about the house since she left, he repeated. What about Robert? Didn't he bring her back home safely that night? Luke asked. I don't know, Mr. Lucas. We haven't seen him either. He could be at his home, but I don't know for sure, the young man answered. Thank you for letting us know. We will figure out what to do. Luke thanked the young man, and he left. As soon as he rode off, Luke turned to his wife and said, Minnie, let me go to Eric's house. I think you were right. Something is not right. I knew it, dear Lord. Please let her be okay, she said. After Luke left, Minnie sat in the living room alone, her mind in turmoil. If there had been an accident, they'd have known by now. If it wasn't an accident, then what was it? What about Robert? Where was he? A thought she didn't want to entertain crossed her mind. Could she have run off with him? But she brushed off the thought quickly. Violet loved her family dearly, and Minnie couldn't picture her leaving them for anything. At this point, the only thing that made sense would be an accident. Oh Lord, please let her be safe, she prayed. The children were fed, bathed, and were now napping when Luke returned. Prosody rate. Minnie could tell that something was wrong the moment he set foot in the house from the look in his eyes. What is it, my love? Was there an accident? She feverishly asked as soon as he sat down. My love, I don't know how to say this to you. Please have a seat, he said, but Minnie remained standing. Is it that bad? She asked, and she could feel her knees begin to buckle. Please sit down, Luke said. Minnie sat next to him on the couch, her hands trembling. Tell me, she said, and braced herself for what she was about to hear. Robert is holding her captive, and he's demanding a ransom of money and gold, Luke said, and he could see the look of astonishment in his wife's face. Gold from where? We haven't got any, she said. Luke then told her everything Eric and his wife had told him about Violet's inheritance. Why would Lindsay tell her brother all that, knowing the kind of a person he is? Minnie asked in disbelief. She thought he had changed, and that's why she invited him here. She's beside herself with grief, and she blames herself for everything. Robert managed to fool everybody, he answered. How did they find out he's the one holding her captive? Minnie asked. They found a note under their front door just before I arrived. They were in shock when I got there, he answered. What are we going to do? Minnie asked in anguish. We've reported at the sheriff's office, and a note was sent out to Storm to return home as soon as possible. We also need to inform the rest of our brothers, he said. I hope he doesn't hurt her, Minnie said. He's a madman and is capable of anything. We're going back to the sheriff's office to plan what to do. Will you be okay here with the children? He asked. Yes, I will. You go and capture that monster. He needs to be locked up for life, she said. I couldn't agree more. Luke answered. Chapter 23. Robert pushed the weather-beaten door and walked in. He placed the bread and milk he'd brought with him on the floor and walked over to the corner where Violet was lying motionless. Could she be dead? He quickly unbound her hands and feet. In a panic, he tapped her on the cheek repeatedly. After a second, her eyes fluttered open. There you are, dear Violet. You can't die on me now, not when I'm so close to my goal, he said as he sat on the floor next to her and gently laid her cold face across his upper leg. Storm? She asked as she struggled to sit up. No, dear, it's just old me, Robert said, and a look of shock crossed her eyes when she remembered where she was. I'm so cold and hungry, Robert. I want to go home, she pleaded as tears rolled down her face. Anytime now, dearest, anytime. I've brought you some food, he said as he passed her the bread and milk. Here, take my coat. I will buy another one tomorrow. Violet tore into the bread as she gulped huge mouthfuls of milk as well. In those 3 days when she'd been held captive, this was the second time Robert had brought her something to eat. His coat, which still had his warmth, also made her feel better, and she could now sit upright without support. How did you find this place? You're practically still a stranger here in Denver, she asked. I would sneak out every day for a few hours and scour around for such a place. Of course, none of you noticed anything, being all busy with your important businesses, he sneered. Robert, we can't stay here much longer. We're both going to freeze to death, she said. I doubt your loving family will let that happen to you. I'm sure by now they're running around like headless chickens trying to find you. But nobody will find us here in those deep woods and in this snow unless they give me what I want, he answered. What happens if they don't obey your orders? Violet asked. Then, my dear, I will have to leave you here to freeze and starve to death, he replied with a wicked smile. Violet knew that Robert would do exactly as he was saying if her family failed to give him what he wanted. She wondered if Storm had been informed of the misfortune, or if he was still blissfully unaware in Boulder. For the sake of her children, she prayed that they gave this depraved man what he wanted. She could bear to lose money and gold, but not her family. The sheriff read the note one more time and then passed it to one of his deputies. This was the second time the Lucas brothers were coming to him in a panic. The first time was when Eric's cattle were rustled, and he, the sheriff, together with his deputies and a few brave men from Denver, had helped recover the stolen cattle from the bandits. But this time, the matter required more urgency. Storm's wife had been kidnapped by his sister-in-law's brother for ransom. He'd found it hard to believe at first, but the handwritten note was all the proof he needed. You say this man is new in town? The sheriff asked. Yes, sir. He could be walking around Denver right now, and nobody would recognize him as the perpetrator, Luke said. I can't believe I'm the one who encouraged my wife to invite him over, Eric said solemnly. We have no time for that, young Mr. Lucas. The deed is already done. Let's now focus on getting Mrs. Lucas home safely. When is Storm arriving back? The sheriff asked. He's on his way as we speak, sir, Luke answered. Great. I suggest we organize a posse, just like the one we had last time. Do you think you can manage that by this evening? The sheriff asked. Yes, sir. I will make sure of it, Luke replied. Okay, you go home and write the note asking him to pick up his money at the spot he's asked for it to be dropped. Of course, the bag will be full of papers and a few stones. I'm sure he will go back to ask Violet to write another note, thus leading us directly to where he's keeping her, the sheriff said. What if that fails? Eric asked. We know the woods around here better than that bandit does. We will look in every nook and cranny until we find her, the sheriff said. He loathed bandits who tried to tarnish his town's name with a passion. He was sure that Robert was holed up in Denver, and he would capture him if it was the last thing he did. Storm arrived at the sheriff's office a few minutes later. He listened with his fists clenched as Luke told him everything that had occurred. How could he have been so blind? Robert had taken him for a fool. He'd been planning to hurt his family, even while Storm was more than willing to help him get on his feet. He hoped the sheriff and his deputies got to Robert first, because if he did, he would tear him to pieces with his bare hands. "We will get him, Storm, and bring Violet back home safely. I'm going to gather around the men we need. As the sheriff said, we will go after him tonight," Luke reassured his brother. It broke his heart to see him in such anguish. "Where has Eric gone?" Storm asked. "He's gone home to check on Lindsay. She's been badly affected by this," Luke answered. "I don't hold it against her, and I'm sure Violet doesn't either," Storm said, and Luke nodded his understanding. Chapter 24. "Violet, I told you they will have to do as I ask," he exclaimed in glee as he waved a piece of paper in the air. "What's that?" Violet asked, her voice feeble from hunger and cold. "I'm going to pick up my gold tonight. As for you, I just might tell them where to find you then," Robert said, unable to hide his joy. He knew Storm would do anything for his wife. "Why don't you let me go now if you're going to get what you wanted?" she begged. "Not until I have the bars of gold and the money in my hands," he answered. Violet couldn't care less about the gold or the money. All she wanted was to go home to her husband and children. "It's awfully cold out here. I hope Violet is okay," Storm said as the posse made its way to the place Eric had dropped off the note for Robert earlier. It was a cold, dark night, and each of the men was armed with a pistol and a torch. "I'm sure she is. Robert wouldn't risk harming her before he receives what he's after. Even he isn't that stupid," Luke replied. "All right, men. This is the spot, I believe," the sheriff said from the front of the posse. "Now what?" one of the men asked. "Now we lay in complete silence and wait," one of the deputies replied. As cold as the night was, all the people present wanted the best for Storm, and none complained. After about half an hour, a movement in the dark caught their attention. The figure approached the bag stealthily and lit a torch to check the contents. The man then let out a shout in anger and kicked the bag with his foot before turning and storming off in a fury. "I told you this would work perfectly. It always does with the greedy ones," the sheriff said, smiling from ear to ear. "Now we follow him to where he's keeping Violet. He came on foot, so it shouldn't be far from here," one of the men observed. "I agree. I suggest we leave our horses here and proceed on foot as well," a deputy said. The rickety door flew open and Violet jumped in fear from her position on the floor. She didn't know who it was, as she wasn't sure whether Robert would come back after he picked up the gold. "I thought your family valued you, Violet," Robert screamed. "Robert, what is it?" she asked meekly. "They tricked me, Violet," he continued yelling. "Tricked you in what way?" she asked again. "They packed stones and papers in the bag instead of my gold and money. Maybe it's time I showed them that I mean business," he thundered, kicking a hole in the ground. "What do you mean?" she asked in a panic. He began walking menacingly towards her, and she recoiled and tried to move back, but there was no space to move to. "If you kill me, they won't send you anything," she said as she covered her head with her hands. "Who says I'm going to kill you?" "I'm only going to cut a piece of you and send it to them. I'll keep doing that until they give me what I need or I run out of pieces to send," he said. He removed a small knife from the back pocket of his trouser, and as he went to lift Violet's hand, the door flew open and the sheriff and his 2 deputies burst into the room. "Get on the ground," the sheriff yelled as one of the deputies leapt on Robert and knocked him to the ground. "Mrs. Lucas, is there anybody else here?" the sheriff asked as he helped her stand up. "No, Sheriff, there isn't. It was just the 2 of us," she said, and tried to take a step forward. She almost fell to the ground, but the sheriff quickly caught her. "You're going home, Mrs. Lucas. Don't worry. Guess who is here with me?" the sheriff said to her with a smile. "Who is?" she asked. "Let's go and see," he said as he gently led her outside. In the darkness, she couldn't quite make out who the person was, but then he spoke. "You see? I'm so sorry, my darling, for leaving you with that crook," Storm said, and Violet somehow summoned the strength and walked into his arms and began to cry tears of joy. "You're safe now." "I thought I would never see you or our children ever again, my love," Violet sobbed as her husband held her tight. They could hear Robert yelling profanities as he was being led away, but none paid him any attention. He was going where he belonged, and he wouldn't be bothering anyone ever again. Violet couldn't believe her eyes when she was being led into their house by her husband. It seemed like ages since she'd been here. "I never thought I would see this house again," she told her husband. "I wasn't going to rest until I found you," he said as he hugged her close. "Why didn't you give him what he wanted?" she asked. "That's your father's gift to you, and I wasn't about to lose it to someone like Robert," he answered. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked. "For loving me enough to come and rescue me," she answered. "I would give my life for yours," he said. "But first, I think you need to freshen up." Violet laughed as she left the room. Tomorrow she would be reunited with her children, and she couldn't wait. Robert had tried to take that away from her, but he had failed miserably. Chapter 25. A day to Christmas Eve. Violet's house was a hive of activity as preparations for the big day kicked off. Violet was still dealing with the aftermath of her ordeal, but she was getting better each day. The nightmares were slowly disappearing, and she'd stopped being too clingy with her kids. As she made her way out of the busy kitchen, she almost collided with her husband, who was coming to look for her, and there was a look of urgency in his eyes. "Robert has sent a note that he wishes to see you tomorrow, on Christmas Eve," Storm told her. "Maybe he should speak to his sister whom he betrayed in such a manner," she said. "He has tried, but Lindsay is adamant that she wants absolutely nothing to do with him," Storm answered. "I have nothing to say to him either," she replied. "I think you should go and hear what he has to say. You might get the closure you need," he said. "You think so?" she asked. "Yes, I do. I will go with you so you can feel safe," he offered. "I would like that. Okay, I will go and see him," she agreed. The following morning after breakfast, Storm and his wife left for the sheriff's office. Violet had now grown curious about what Robert wanted to say to her. It reminded her of her uncle, who'd also asked to see her after tormenting her for a long time. Her heart was pounding so loudly in her chest she could hear it in her ears as they walked into the sheriff's office. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Lucas. Please have a seat," the sheriff welcomed them happily. "Thank you, sir," Storm answered as they were shown to their seats. "Deputy, bring Robert to the office," the sheriff directed his deputy. Violet watched as a shackled Robert shuffled into the office. He was a far cry from the man who'd almost turned their lives upside down. "Storm, Violet, thank you for coming," Robert began. He was disappointed as he'd wanted to talk to Violet alone. He'd wanted to try and manipulate her into getting him released. "You asked to see me. What do you have to say?" Violet asked, her eyes looking straight into his. "Forgive me for what I did to you," he said, but they could both tell he wasn't being sincere. "Robert, all you had to do was ask for assistance, and we would have done so gratefully. Instead, you almost took me from my family. It's hard, but I choose to forgive you in the Christmas spirit," she said. That evening, Violet felt as if a weight had been lifted off of her shoulders. Storm had been right. She needed to see Robert one last time. She walked into the kitchen and found that her sisters-in-law were almost done with the cooking. They'd all availed themselves selflessly, but Violet could see that Lindsay was still struggling with what had happened. "Lindsay, dear, may I have a word?" she called. Violet led her to the living room where it was quiet and showed her to a seat. "Yes, Violet?" Lindsay asked, trying hard to hide her nervousness. "Robert asked to see me and I went to the sheriff's office today," Violet said, and immediately Lindsay's eyes filled up with tears. "I'm so sorry, Violet. Had I known all this would happen, I would have never invited Robert here. I never want to see him again," she sobbed, and Violet could tell that she still blamed herself for what had happened. "I know it wasn't your fault. Robert is consumed by jealousy and greed, but he's still your brother. I know it will take time, but you need to try to forgive him like I have," Violet said. "Thank you, Violet. You don't know what your understanding means to me," Lindsay said. They hugged, and all was forgiven. On Christmas morning, everything was ready for the big day. Violet was awoken by her kids who couldn't believe Christmas was here. She laid a gentle kiss on her sleeping husband's lips and went to look out of her bedroom window. A thick layer of snow covered everything she could see, giving the land an angelic look. Only a few days ago, she'd thought she wouldn't see this day. "Merry Christmas, Mama," the twins shouted in unison as soon as they saw their mother coming down the stairs. Ben and Sarah stood near the Christmas tree arguing over something. "What are you two fighting about? Don't you know it Christmas morning?" their mother asked, and they instantly stopped. "Nothing, Mama. Sarah is just being a baby," Ben said. "I'm not a baby," Sarah objected. "You are too," Ben taunted her. "Why can't you two be like the twins? They never fight," their mother admonished them. "Sorry, Mama," Sarah said and hung her head. "What do you want for lunch?" she asked after they were done with breakfast. Immediately, each of the children had an idea of what they wanted to eat. It's going to be an interesting afternoon, Violet thought. Storm's brothers and their families started arriving at the ranch late in the afternoon for the party. The events of the past few days had weighed heavily on them, but they all looked happy and relaxed now as they trooped to the ranch, the cold weather notwithstanding. When everyone was comfortably seated at the dining table, Violet signaled for the local women she'd hired to work as servers for that evening to start bringing the food out. The kids finished eating first, and they went to play in another room. When the adults finished with their meals and the table cleared, Violet stood up to give her speech. "I want to thank you all for coming here today. This year has brought my family both laughter and tears. Laughter because I came to learn that my father left me much more than I had thought earlier, and tears because I almost never made it to this day. Storm and I wish to let you all know that should any one of you ever have a problem, don't hesitate to come to us for help. We have more than we ever thought we could, and we're happy to share with you if you are ever in need," she concluded amid wild cheers from the clan. The night before, they had agreed with Storm that there was no need to go into details about how much they were worth now, lest they attract another character like Robert. That said, they would let Gail and Thomas, Tara and Henry, and Eileen and Greg, and their families know that they would always be there for them. They knew Violet had come into some money, but they didn't have as much details as Minnie, Luke, Lindsay, and Eric did. "Merry Christmas, everyone," Violet said. "Merry Christmas," they all answered in unison. This was the beginning of wonderful times to come for the Lucas clan.